Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But honestly, that isn't the reason you hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts and aliens, and you think to yourself, that isn't real, they're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy, something like that. You just can't believe it until something happens, something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way that you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you, or maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a bit bigger than you thought. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down that it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus is taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it, or that thing, he called it Skinwalker, after an old Navajo tale his grandfather told him. But I'll tell you the story the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, killing coyotes for $50 a skin. We lived on a dairy farm in Ohio, and sometimes we'd kill a calf. We'd do it every night because we needed the money, and sometimes while we were out, we'd come upon a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking because we didn't have a car or a four-wheeler back then, and we'd cut through the woods, and that's when we came upon it. Blood. Everywhere. Splattered on the trees and the grass and the creek. Everywhere. And at first we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen it sometimes. They scavenge and then start hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs, but this wasn't like that. When a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They'll pick off one that's weak, sick, old, or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner someplace it can't get out of, and then they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its throat is gone, and then it'll drop dead. It's quick. It's clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, and wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were three bodies just torn apart. You'd see a head here, a leg there, a torso over there. Predators don't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. What had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of carcasses, and we think it's something that we've got to take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs, but I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. I was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was about the only gun I could reliably use. Dad had the shotgun, and he wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life. I've been all over the world, and I never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Deer and fox and rabbits and raccoons and birds. Just scared. Now keep in mind, this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock. Except the fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to be awake. But they weren't just awake. They were moving. I saw flocks of birds that night fly straight into trees, just trying to get out of there. We came upon a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple, thinking that it was what we were looking for. But then we saw that they were running towards us. They ran right past us, didn't even notice. And then some deer did the same. And then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. We should have put it together that maybe whatever we were tracking, it wasn't something we were supposed to see, and it wasn't something we could kill. I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go toward trouble, to fight. And knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally get into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks. Then a lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land. But where the deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step, like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing around 40 pounds nearly tore my damn throat out once, and all that means is that it's quick and it's hard to hit. So we follow the tracks, and it doesn't take long for us to find where it is. There's this old schoolhouse that sits on the top of the hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, and nobody lived there, not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was just some sick kid riding a high, but we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards, and we hear this noise, a screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds, one a high-pitched screech, another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We get within 20 yards, and we hear the sound. I can remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Dad looks at me, kneels down, and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him, 'cause we're about to corner him." Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator, but we can tell by the tracks that it's just one. He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, probably rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting until it doesn't move anymore, and then slit its throat. If it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it to get it off of him. So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side so I can see what it is. I wish to this day that I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tearing off its flesh and throwing what it doesn't nibble at its side. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white, human-looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey hunched over. Its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that, and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat to try to get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't never heard true silence before that, and not after it. But for 2 seconds, nothing. Nothing made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around, made this shrill cry and jumped on Dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed it. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind, but it was on him, tearing parts of him off. I start shooting it with a 22-point blank, but it barely bled. The thing. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It clawed at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, ripping off the skin, then it moved up. It tore off his throat, his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging in and ripping off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones in that tube in your neck, and then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ends up in the thing's shoulder, and my dad ends up on my back. I'm running. And by God, I'm running faster than I'd ever run before or after. And I know it's following me. I end up back in the woods, opposite the ones we'd been in. I'm heading towards my landlord's house because it's a half a mile away. I can hear this thing screeching and moaning. I hear the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I'm not looking back. Finally, I trip into gravel. I look up, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I scream and cry and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What's that on your back?" He asked me, and just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. Suddenly we hear it screeching, and he grabs me. My dad gets thrown on the ground, and I'm fighting him, crying because I think we can still save him somehow. But my dad had been gone before I even picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside, and they're locking doors and getting guns ready. The landlord looks at me asking, "What happened? What happened?" But I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something dangerous out there. All the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops, and they'll be there in 15 minutes. We look outside and see it walk in front of the fire they'd made. I don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like an ape, and suddenly something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's my landlord's dog. Just the body though, not his head or legs. And we start pushing things in front of the door and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open and we hear metal and glass just getting ripped apart. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent like it was before. We could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol, and no sooner did I cock the hammer back did we hear something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out because it was inside with us. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as that thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It got its hands through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that, put the barrel right up to its wrist, and pulled the trigger, cut its hand clean off. That only made it angry, though. It started pushing on the door, clawing. We were on one side pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other doing the same. That just wasn't going to hold, so someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing, and there are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of that door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police showed up. I was still glued to that door, what was left of it, and the sun was up before they got me off it. They put me in a hospital for a while, and a lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back, not for a long, long time. When we got back home, I got a job from the landlord working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about that thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf, or maybe a bear that had migrated north or something. I asked him about how they could say that when they had the hand. He looks at me stunned. He tells me that hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car wrecked and drove into a tree, died on impact. The hand was never found, probably taken away by an animal. And the cops, when they would acknowledge the hand even existed at all, said that it simply was the paw of a bear that looked like a human hand. I never ended up talking to that landlord again. I guess he went missing when I was in basic, and the cops never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away, but I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't, even if I had the whole goddamn US Army at my back. And that was my father's story of the rake or skinwalker. I'm still not sure what to think. But as I grew older, and when my mother died, I don't think my father felt that he had anything left, and he might as well settle old scores. He went back into those woods, I guess, and he never came back. The FBI was called, and they did a show and dance for everyone involved, but I knew that they weren't really looking, and they never did find him. I'm 21 and a college senior from Connecticut. I live in a semi-rural area about 20 minutes from the closest supermarket and fast food. I go to school in Washington, D.C. Not the nice part either, but the part where substance users are a problem and cops are reassuring rather than troublesome. I've definitely seen some things in my day. It would be good to mention here that I'm not some glandular freak. I'm 6 feet 1 inch and 240 pounds, most of it muscle, and Lord knows that I could drop 15 pounds or so. I love to smoke, drink, and eat sumi. And being the good student that I am, I picked a real major, accounting. I interned for a mid-sized PR firm doing accounting work and getting paid $20 an hour. College is expensive, so I deliver pizzas at night after the office closes. It's a cheap sort of pizza place with an absurdly large delivery radius around 20 minutes from my house and 5 minutes from the beach. My place is north of there and would deliver probably another 15 minutes past my house. I'm actually typing this at work in between examining the fine print on our client contracts to ensure that we are charging them every penny. Believe me, they do everything they can to short us. But anyway, basically the further north you go from the pizza place, the more countryside it gets. I work until close, and this happens at around 9:45 p.m. I'm in the back folding pizza boxes like a good little boy, and the counter girl comes back with a delivery slip. She tells me that this customer sounded weird on the phone, kind of like he was talking through a fan or through his hands, and that he was kind of gurgling. My Washington, D.C. experience instantly makes me think of some user, if you catch my drift. Although around here it's way more likely to be some benzo freak automatically assuming some weird interaction will occur. I look at the address. It's basically in the middle of nowhere. I'm a little mad because I don't want to drive that far, but screw it. Not to mention it's the weirdest ticket I've ever seen. The guy ordered a large pizza with anchovies, ground beef, ham, sausage, pepperoni, etc. Literally $15 worth of extras on top of his pizza. I go to ask the counter girl if this is right, and she says she thinks so. She couldn't really make it out though, so she said she did her best. She's about 16 years old, so I cut her some slack. Maybe she was daydreaming while she took the call, so I'll just give them a call back to be sure. I dial the phone and it rings 5, 10, 20, 30 times, but no one answers. I hang up and call again. This time the phone goes right to the number you have dialed, does not have a voicemail box that has been set up yet. Goodbye. Okay then. My manager decides to just make the pizza as ordered, and we would proceed from there. I go out to deliver a separate pizza to a hilariously big guy and a couple who invited me in for drinks, but I don't drink or smoke when I'm working. I was hoping by the time I got back that someone else delivered that pizza order. And surprise, surprise, no one did. And it wasn't my turn again to pick up an order, and begrudgingly I take the pizza and get in my car. I enter the address in my phone. It's on a side street adjacent to a park locals call open space, which despite the name is actually about 500 acres of straight woods. It's about 25 minutes away, basically the edge of our range. I put on some dubstep and crank my turbo subby while taking off towards this road. Now if you're not from a rural area, this can be hard to explain. Winter in the woods is scary. There's never a single sound ever unless there's something larger than a cat walking around. It's just you in complete silence. Finally I make it to the address. There are a few houses on the street, but they sit on probably 5 acres, so they're spaced out a fair amount. I'm looking for number 1134. I pass 1130, then a long stretch of road of nothing, and then it picks up again at 1144. What the heck? I just want to get this over with and get the next delivery without getting attacked by some pill head over something as small as a pizza. I try calling their number again, and it rings and then stops ringing. Wait a minute. Someone picked up, but there's no voice. Instead I hear a buzzing or a humming sound. They hooked up to my car stereo, and it's getting louder and louder until I just hang up because I don't want to ruin my speakers. The windows are fogging up at this point. I'm pulled over between 2 of these houses right when I roll the windows down, and I am overcome by this odor of decaying trash like driving through Newark, New Jersey. It's so gross. I put the car in first and start pulling towards the next house trying to escape it. At the end of the driveway there's a stanchion with a light on top. The plan was to pull into this house and knock and ask if maybe they gave me the wrong number over the phone. That would make sense for these kinds of people. I'm probably 100 feet away when I see someone step out of the darkness and into the light at the bottom of the driveway. I sigh. Thank goodness. It's the guy that ordered. I'm expecting the guy to be all over the place, leaning over, acting completely out of his mind, but he's actually pretty calm. I stop the car about 10 feet away from him. He's wearing a big black coat that looks 3 times too big for him, even though he's probably got 5 inches on me. I don't look right at him at first. I grab the pizza and step out of the car. Then I grab the ticket and prepare a change if he gives cash. I say to him, "Hey sir, sorry about the wait and for all the calls I made. Delivery's pretty far." There's no response from him. I realize that I should be watching him considering the red flags, and the smell is extremely pungent, but I know it's not trash day. I get the pizza on the roof of my car, and he's standing there under the light on the opposite side. I finally pay enough attention to get a good look at him. The guy is basically a giant. He's wearing no shoes, and he has ripped up jeans, and there are stains everywhere. I try to get a good look at his face, and his eyes seem to be sunken in. I can't even see the actual pupils with the light from here. It's like they're just black craters. I'm getting really sketched out at this point, because the guy still hasn't moved or said a word. I stop the process and stare at him. He's staring right back at me with those freaky eyes. His head is sort of bobbing side to side, but not in any sort of fluid sense at all. Kind of like a car door, like how it stops halfway open, and then you give it another shove, and it stops at the all-the-way point. I watch this head do this with no real pattern for about 10 seconds. I'm starting to get more uneasy between the stench, his head movement, and the eyes and him still completely ignoring me. I stand frozen, and so does he. Without breaking eye contact, I take my phone out of my pocket and hold it level with the roof so I can look at the guy and my phone at the same time. Curiosity overflowing, I decide to go to the recent calls on my phone, and I redial his number. The phone starts ringing, but I don't hear it anywhere. Wait a second. I do hear it. It's coming out of the quiet of the woods. I can hear a faint distant cell phone ringing about 50 yards away in the woods, and I'm kicking myself at this point, almost soiling myself. The guy's just standing there, still doing the head thing, but I swear to God I see him smiling. Finally, I get the courage to speak. Can you please come get this? Also, I think you might have dropped your phone or something when you were hiding a body or whatever in the woods. I laughed nervously, still thinking maybe this guy just dug too deep into the prescription pills, and I see his mouth open, head still bobbing, feet planted on the ground. He makes a sort of low, guttural, quick grunt, and then a high grunt, and then a low grunt, and they're sort of soft, kind of like someone clearing their throat. At this point, I'm ready to book it to the driver's seat if I have to. And just as I go to redial that phone again, I hear him talking. That phone's not mine. The pause between the phone's not and mine was way too long. Phone's not literally sounded like one word. Mine came off as an octave higher. My mind is in DEFCON 5, full-on panic mode. My knees are weak, and I'm literally about to pass out. I push the pizza to the far side of the roof away from me, and I finally muster up. Sir, you're freaking me out. I got a 45 and less than $20 on me. Just take this so I can leave. When I say this, his head bobbing stops. His eyes are dark and burning a hole through me, and he opens his mouth again. What his? What? I ask stunned. It was his. The phone was his. The guy starts coming towards my car, not a step, but like one huge muscle spasm that propels him forward. The phone was his. He repeats. I'm on the verge of tears at this point. The guy jerk jumps again, now closer to the car. Phone's not his anymore. I blubber wordlessly, then gather myself and scream. I'm going to call the cops, man, if you just don't get out of here. I see this guy smile that creepy smile, and without moving his mouth, I hear him saying a completely different voice, a voice I've never heard before. Go away. Stop following me. I will call the police. In another big jerky motion, the thing reaches forward, takes the pizza off the roof, and places a couple of round things that I later identify as quarters on the roof. They're surrounded by this dark liquid that spreads over the roof. I don't even think. Just get in the car and peel out down the road. I leave the hot sleeve for the pizza too. I leave everything. Don't even close the door all the way. I get down the road going about 80 for a quarter mile, then pull a U-turn because I don't want to get even more lost with that psycho out there. I whip down the road past the place where I had just been, and he's gone. I finally get to the end of the road, and there's a stop sign to merge with the main road. I look right to make sure it's clear, then I look left. That thing's face is 12 inches from my own where I turn. I tactically have a heart attack and peel off down the road. I finally make it back to the pizza place, shaking like crazy. I smoke just to calm down, which I never do when I'm working. I walk in the front door of the pizza place. Hey, a guy at the open space house just called back. He said you forgot some food, but he only ordered the pizza, right? He wants you to come back. Then I start crying. I look at my phone, which had been thrown through the car when I was driving. There are 14 missed calls from his number. All the voicemails are empty, except the last one. All I can hear is ragged breathing and those low, grunting sounds. I'm bawling my eyes out in front of this hot counter girl, but I don't even care. I sit for 10 minutes trying to calm down, and then I remember the change that he had left on the roof. I steadily go out to the car and turn on a flashlight. The roof of the car was covered in the most viscous, weird fluid, but it smells like copper. I throw up, and the panel gap between the trunk and the end of the rear window, I find the quarters. They're covered in that same gross maple syrup goop, and they're stuck to it along with the fluid. I can now see what appears to be a soft little chunk of tissue. I go to open my car, and my veins turn to ice. There is a single line of this fluid going from the front quarter panel to the driver's side door. That freaking thing tried to open my door when it was next to me at the stop sign. I go back in, crying harder now. I tell the counter girl to try and call the number again for me. She tries over and over, but the phone goes right to voicemail. The next morning, I give the number to my uncle, who is a police captain a few towns over. He says the number is a burner phone paid in cash, basically untraceable, and it appears to be turned off. Now, I sleep with the lights on these days. I was 23, stalking in the woods in the Ozarks of Arkansas, to be exact, with some new gear that I had been saving for months. Boots, attack vest, even a mil-spec gas mask. It was like Christmas being where I was and wanting to field test some personal prototypes. I had my nugget on hand. It wouldn't do much against the big bears, but it would ruin any snake, stray dog, or cougar's day right to hell. I had a bunch of strippers and 2 clipazines I built, and I wanted to field test them in my pouches. I got some rolled-up targets stuck in my loops and a light complement of survival gear. Compass, topographical map, thermal blanket, extra undies, MREs, canteen, and camelback, the works. basically prepared for the inevitable invasion of any type. I was having a great time romping around the woods, playing with my field of view in the mask, testing the reliability of the clipazines, and generally having fun. I wandered next to a creek bed and decided it was time to practice my guerrilla tactics. It was late summer, early fall, so no danger of getting my gear wet in the non-existent stream. My stuff was in more danger of water damage from my own sweat. After triple-checking my safety, I proceeded to do a series of screen slides and uphill hustles in full survivalist gear. Needless to say, I got winded really quick. I stood panting in that dry stream bed and decided to check my position with my topographical map and compass so I could set a course for home. In the middle of reorienting myself, I caught wind of a smell. At first, I thought it was my sweat, but the funk quickly evolved into something worse. A dark undercurrent of rot, deep notes of animal musk, a bassy score of raw garbage punctuated by garlicky timpani, and a thick black score of something between skunk and onion sludge. I went into straight operating mode, popped an Addy from my pouch for extra focus, pulled the clipazine from my nugget. It seemed to be working fine, but if I was going to have to shoot something, I prefer not to have any risk of jamming. The smell made me gag, and I nearly puked up that Addy tablet. The smell was that strong at this point. Whatever the source was, it was definitely mobile and getting closer to me. Screw it. I pulled on my mask from around my neck and over my face. It helped a bit, but the mask wasn't 100% airtight around the joints, so some of the smell got in. I walked cautiously and slowly along the creek bed toward where the slope was shallowest, listening for twigs snapping or animal sounds from above me. I definitely heard something shuffling around up there, and it sounded bigger than what my nugget was up for. It was a near constant snuffle, grunt, and sloppy, uncoordinated crunching around bark and leaves, all mixed with the smell. My mind immediately jumped to big bear, and I mean big, possibly even rabbit if it smelled like that. And let me tell you something about Ozark big bears, straight from my dad's mouth. My dad's lived in the Ozark for 58 years, and in that time, only two things have managed to shake him: the challenge of fatherhood and the big bears. According to him, the native black bears were hunted to near extinction between the 40s and 50s, and to correct this, the ANRC, NRCS, and Arkansas Fish and Game Commission released 250 bears into the Ozark and Ouachita Mountains. Their website insists that they were all black bears. My dad insists that that is bullcrap. According to him, more than a few of the bears released there were brown bears. They inbred with a few remaining local bears and the reintroduced blacks. Thanks to a little phenomenon known as hybrid vigor, the resulting offspring were bigger and meaner than their parents, and screw me, were they fertile. When I asked him to prove it, he simply left the summer porch, went upstairs, and came back with a manila folder labeled BB. He pulled out a couple of Polaroids and asked me to take a look. I saw a big black and brown something rooting around a clothesline. Dad directed my attention to the clothesline about 50 feet away from us, between the two poles, about 5 to 6 feet above the ground. It was the same clothesline in the picture. The something's shoulder was about a fart's length under the line, despite being further in the background. I looked through the other pictures. One was rooting through the trash. Another was barely concealed by trees, all of them slightly shaky. Detail was hard to come by, but I was convinced. My dad told me two things about how to avoid getting attacked by the big bears. Big bears are dumb as crap, something to do with them being hybrid. This makes them more dangerous than other bears because they're not afraid of you. This also makes them smell like crap, and you'll smell them coming a mile off. If you smell a big bear, get inside, get upstairs, but take the 12 gauge and some deer slugs. If you do see a big bear, and you ain't home, or you ain't got a shotgun loaded with slugs, hide up a tree if you can. They're faster than you, so there isn't any use running. I tell you all of this because after 23 years, I'd finally managed to prove my dad wrong about something. Well, half wrong. There's something in the Ozarks that matches my dad's pictures of big bears, but whatever they are, they sure as heck aren't bears. So back to my story. I would have stayed in that creek bed and waited for that something to screw off on its own business, but the light was already slanting through the trees. As bad as my dad made Big Bear sound, I was sure as heck not wanting to be stuck with a god-dang rabid one after dark, and instead, I opted to climb up the opposite edge of the creek bed. I had to scramble over some big rock outcroppings and half stand, half lean against the slope of the hill, but I figured that if anything, that would just be an extra layer of protection against that something out there. I'd gotten a few glimpses of it over my shoulder as I climbed, but this was my first good look at it. I just couldn't stop staring. Like I said in my previous post, this was not a bear. It was bear-like, but not a bear. I've been into sci-fi my entire life, and even got Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials from my awesome late stepmom. So when I saw this thing for the first time, my freaking nerd brain immediately went, oh, a solider. Except it wasn't. It looked like a solider. A grizzly bear and a sloth had a three-way on top of a garage heap to make it. It had a long prognathous snout like a stubby trunk with big angular shoulders, feet that looked like manhole covers covered in dirty matted fur, and a body like a furry blimp. Its fur was the same charcoal black and dark glow brown that I saw in the pictures, and full of mats and clumps of dirt. I mean, I stared at it for so long, drinking in those details, trying to make sense of it for 2.5 minutes, and it somehow didn't notice me. Jesus, these things were dumb. I remember feeling a twinge of relief. If it hadn't noticed me yet, trying to scrabble out of a rocky gully, it probably won't notice me sneaking away from it. It's going to sound ridiculous, but I farted then. The something stopped. My breath stopped. And my heart stopped. The only sound in those woods at that moment was my freaking fart echoing, and the sound of my nose blistering under the something's odoriferous assault. It was like slow motion when the thing turned its head, looked back at me, sniffed the air, and stood up. It had been shuffling around crouched low to the ground the entire time. What I thought were shoulder blades were its freaking elbows. It could tie its shoes without bending, but its paws probably would have crushed its Air Jordans to bits. They were like trash can lids. It sniffed the air again and coughed or barked like it was asking me a question. It sounded like Gorp. I swear on my mom, that's what it sounded like. Gorp. So there I was, the idiot who didn't listen to his dad, the awkward cringe-lord who freaking farts when he's trying to sneak away from a freaking Gorp. I aimed at it in center mass and I fired. It didn't thwack into the Gorp because, hey, if you're going to die, might as well give your killer a stupid name in your head, right? Instead, the shot thwomped, if that makes sense. There was a puff of dirt and hair when it thwomped. And bless my luck, the Gorp actually flinched from the impact. I waited to see blood. I guess the Gorps are so covered in nasty flea-ridden hair mats that, over time, their poor hygiene gave them natural body armor, because I didn't see any red at all. What it did do was rear up and gorth at me, a low growl that had my colon deciding that it was a warning, because it was producing bricks enough to construct a barricade. I worked the bolt and fired another shot, this time at its ugly sloth-bearer, elephant-looking face. And this time it did thwack, and so did the dirt a few feet to the thing's left because it ricocheted off its skull. The thing stood there staring at me like it was too dumb to realize that it could have just stood in the stream bed and grabbed me by my face while I pelted it with useless bullet after bullet. I yelled at it and fired a third shot in any direction at all, trying to scare it off. The Gorp or Gorth or Big Bear or whatever it was dropped to all force, lurching forwards towards me. Then I did a 180 and shuffled away. It worked. I stood there until the sky turned blue to orange before I snapped out of it and tactically retreated back home. When I got back, I told my dad the story. I probably should have mentioned that I was visiting him for a few days. He could probably smell a big bear on me, so it was no use lying to him. When I got to the part about what the big bears really were, he refused to believe me. Then he got pissed at me, locked the doors, and camped out upstairs for the rest of our visit. I had to freaking bring him beer from downstairs when he started to talk. The weird thing is, as scared as he was and as weirded out as I was seeing him that scared, I wasn't scared myself. I remember that very clearly, not being scared at all. I guess you could say I was just too interested or curious to be scared, because if I was scared, I would have just bolted away, and I'd probably be typing this from inside of a year-old Gorp turd. If I had to guess, that Adderall I popped probably kept me from switching into run home scared to mama mode. Well, that's how I met a Gorp and lived. It was around November of last year, and I had just moved to Washington State, being new to the area. I liked the woods, so a few friends of mine, who were huge in-a-woods fiends, decided to take me out to a secluded spot. What the hell, I thought. I'll do it. I need some time away from work anyway. I got the weekend off, packed my bag, cleaned the rifle, and headed over to my friend's house. We ended up about 25 or 30 miles away from the Canadian border in this forest that seemed to go on forever. I was really digging it because my home state didn't have anything like this. There were 6 of us and 2 dogs, a Labrador and a Rottweiler. Each person also had either a hunting rifle or a shotgun with a handgun, except for me. We parked our cars on this tiny dirt road used by game wardens or border patrol and hiked about 4 miles into the woods. By this time, it was already starting to get a little dark. We decided to build a fire right away, so we could set up tents. Two of the group and one of the dogs went out to gather while the rest of us started setting up the tent. It was one of those huge 6 to 8 person ones. November gets cold up there, but the tent was set up in about 15 minutes, and the trio still weren't back. We said, screw it, and started a fire with some branches from around the site. We started hearing crashing noises headed our way, like someone was running their butts off. The two guys came barreling through, wide-eyed, and the dog was nowhere to be seen. They started yammering on about seeing one of the other guys out in the woods acting weird, so they started trying to get close, and every time they got close, though, he would just move away. They said at one point he just disappeared, and then popped up not 10 feet behind them. They also mentioned a really bad rotten meat and spoiled milk smell popping up around them. They tried asking what was up, but there was no answer, and then apparently he took off, sprinting like Usain Bolt into the woods. The dog took off after him, barking its head off, and the two dudes lost both the guy and the dog pretty soon, and the smell started disappearing as well. Far off, they heard a weird screeching followed by a really loud dog's yelp. Then the smell came back with a vengeance, this time with what they described as mad giggling. They got out of there and back to the camp, and they got really angry at the dude, but all of us who were there vouched for the guy. And so pretty soon we were all weirded out, but still thought that it was just this really messed up elaborate joke. I said as much and got yelled at, and then had, well, where the heck is the dog, then tossed at me. Good point. And at this point, though, the sun was already well on its way down, so we built the fire up and brought out some Coleman lanterns as well. All of us huddled around the fire, eating MREs, and our guns were at hand. About 15 minutes after dark, the remaining dog, the Rottweiler, kind of perked up and started growling, and I mean they were really aggressively growling as well. The smell popped back up, and the guys were not wrong about that smell. I had smelled rotten deer carcasses that have smelled fresher than this. Weird groaning started up, and you could hear branches and leaves cracking around the perimeter of our camp. The noping intensified all around, and the dog was going ballistic, so one of the guys with a shotgun, Greg, stood up and fired off 3 rounds of buckshot randomly into the woods. This hellacious screech came out of the woods and started moving away from us fast, and the smell dissipated as well. We waited about an hour, and then decided to try and get some sleep with 2 people on guard at all times. The first watch was me and another guy, Victor. The dog was chilling around the fire as well, and 2 hours in, nothing happened, so we woke up Greg and Tom for their turn. After being asleep for a little while, I woke up to that smell, and Greg was yelling his head off. We got up and headed outside. Greg was looking around the edge of the woods with a spotlight and calling out Tom's name. I asked what happened. They had been sitting there when they heard one of the guys from earlier calling out from the woods. The dog started growling and rushed the spot, and Tom followed after. The dog went through some bushes, and he lost him, so Tom followed him into the woods. Greg had been yelling for him when he heard Tom begin to say something before he was cut off. I can't leave him out there, so we all put on some clothes, grabbed a flashlight or a spotlight for each person and our guns, and headed out. By this time, the smell was everywhere and was making most of us rather nauseous. But we kept going because we wanted to find Tom. We found some of his tracks, but lost the trail when they just stopped. Literally no other footprints after a while, and none leading back the way he'd come. One of the guys at the back was shining his light around, and kind of stopped and made this sort of weird noise, then started yelling, "You freaking jerk. I've been worried sick about you." The rest of the group walked over to look, and there was Tom standing a good 20 feet away, but he was standing very wrong. "Are you okay, buddy? You need some help?" He just stood there, deadpan, and slowly nodded yes. A few of us walked over and put an arm around his shoulders to kind of support him. We noticed that he reeked, and the dude hadn't even been out here for a full day. Now laughs abound except for him, and we thought nothing of it except worried that maybe he fell and hit his head or something. Back at the camp, we tried to lay him down, but he just refused to, so we let him stay outside by the fire. A couple of us went to sleep, but Greg, Vic, and I decided to stay up and keep an eye on him. Watching him, he did weird jerk muscle spasm type things every now and then. Very creepy stuff. We thought that it might be something serious. He was mostly quiet and slow to respond to things until it came to food. We gave him an MRE to eat, and he only ate the meat out of it. We shrugged it off, and then he got up and started moving around, very jerky-like, looking towards the woods. He asked us if we wanted to come into the woods with him for firewood. Besides the fact that it was pitch black out, besides the fire, and also the huge stack of firewood that we collected on the way back, it wasn't all that weird. He jerked something like a shrug before walking weirdly into the woods, and at this point, we were on guard and didn't try to stop him. Greg got up a few minutes later to step into the tent for something, so I was outside with Vic when the smell hit my nose like a ton of bricks, and I gagged. Then I started hearing some sort of gibbering and giggling. I'd never been more freaked out in my life, and you could tell that Vic was feeling the same. Greg came out in time to hear it really well, and then went inside to wake everyone up. He froze at the tent flap, and then started cursing, which woke everyone up. I didn't know why he was cursing, but it was working. When they were all up and awake, he counted everyone, and you could see him turn white. "What's up, dude?" Apparently while he was inside, he did a quick body count, and there were 4 bodies inside. Someone or something had been chilling in our tent, without us realizing that it had gotten in. We lost it hard at that moment, and then everyone started asking where Tom was. At this time, the gibbering gets louder, and you can hear a bunch of nonsense moving through the woods. We hear Tom's voice calling at us from the woods to come help him, but it's all off-key, and every now and then he would start giggling. We built the fire up and sat around it with all the lanterns on full and weapons at hand until the sun started coming up. As soon as it was enough to see, we put the fire out and packed our stuff and made for the vehicles. We started hearing the giggling and the smell returned, and we just got out of there back for the car. We got there, and there were scratches all over them, and most of the windows were smashed, and the seats were ripped to shreds. We just needed them babies to run, so we tossed the keys into the ignition and heard the sweet, glorious sound of an internal combustion engine starting up. We tossed our stuff in, got in, and sped out of there. We didn't talk about it for a few months, and most of us didn't even admit that it happened. One of the guys with us told us later that he'd seen Tom at the edge of the woods, staring at us as we left, and apparently he had this very creepy grin on his face, and I believe him. I know that I'll never go camping that far away again without at least a lot more people than 6, but I believe that was my first run-in with skinwalkers. In the summer of 2013, I decided it was time to kill coyotes for that sweet, sweet fur. I grabbed my bare-bones basic AR-15 that I got for cheap. I like the way an AK slings affixed, so I ghettoed a sling point to put on the barrel. I slung it on my right side around my neck, messenger bag style, and took my ATV up to a cabin on the mountain. Upon arriving, I took the key to my ATV and started looking around. I had been throwing squirrel and rabbit guts into the woods to attract predators. Checking my bait, I found it all gone, and a strange feeling persisted. The guy who lives on the mountain, just down the road, left in his car, just as I decided that I should look around in the woods. Every time I stepped, I kept thinking that I heard another footstep shuffling through the grass and brush. I saw a stick-figured shape thing at a distance a little bit down the hill from me, and I sort of waved at it, and it slipped behind a tree. I thought, okay, goodbye, and walked back to the cabin, deciding to sit around and just drink for a while. I started hearing coyote yelps and stuff in the distance, so I got my gat ready to blast a couple of fools. I sat with the lights off on the porch, but nothing came by. Then the yelping turned into a distant "help me." I looked over to the neighbor's house, and the lights were off. It didn't click that he left, and I got up and listened. "Help me! Help me!" I thought, oh God, he broke his leg and is stuck in the woods with coyotes or something. I got close enough into the woods to tell that it was on an ATV trail, and I decided to take my ATV and AR driving towards the person saying help me when I came to a U-shaped dip in the path. Without hitting my brakes, I just coasted down it. I heard something right in front of me on the trail scream help me, and I freaked out trying to turn. I ended up flipping my ATV, and I can't really remember, but I blacked out for a minute and woke up under the ATV with it pinned on top of me. I sat still and waited for my eyes to adjust before feeling around. My left leg was pinned under the ATV, and I tried pushing it, but I couldn't get it off. It's like I got 100 pounds heavier in a couple of seconds. The sling around my neck told me that I still had a rifle. I dragged it to me, realizing my arm was bleeding in the meantime. I checked over the gun. The handguard was messed up and the stock was cracked, but it appeared to still be functional. I've got 30 rounds to keep me safe until the night's over or someone finds me, and I sat and listened closely to the sounds of the forest before I heard something shuffling in the grass. That silence is everything. It's dead quiet, and I don't think I've ever felt more fear than I have in this moment. I heard it shuffling around. Help me! Help me! I didn't know if I should respond or just sit in silence. Its shuffling got closer and something appeared over the ATV, like if you had fallen at a bar and the bartender sort of looked at you funny. This thing looked like it was 9 feet tall, frozen solid. I twiddled my fingers, reaching for my gun, brought it to my shoulder, and sat there pointed at whatever this thing was. I didn't want to look at it because I just felt so much fear. Help me. I heard it again. I heard it climbing over the ATV. I looked away, but something grabbed my face. My mind went completely blank, looking for the trigger, but I couldn't find it. Slowly it moved my head over, and I was face to face with this thing. It looked like how almost everyone describes them. A golem that had done crack, carved up its face with sunken cheeks and deep eyes. To this day, I've never smelled anything quite as bad as the breath from that thing. I felt the flash hider on my AR bump into something, and I remembered that I had it aimed at the thing. My brain rebooted, and I screamed as loud as I could. It screamed back. I started yanking, not pulling or squeezing the trigger as fast as I could. The gun was going off, and my ears started to ring. It grabbed my hair and started slamming my head into the ground as fast as it could, still pulling the trigger as fast as I could. It ripped the gun from my hand and started beating me with it. It was still screaming as loud as it could while beating me over the head with my own gun. Light started flickering through the woods. I was about to black out when I heard something louder than the screaming. I swear I saw the thing's head fly open. I dropped my gun, screamed like a child that had just been shoved into an oven, and ran for it. My gun was dropped 10 feet from my head, and the light was getting closer. I didn't know if I was dying or being saved. Somebody started screaming my name, telling me to hold on. Something was tugging my arm. I looked over, and it was the guy who lived down the road. He had a huge revolver, a Magnum Research BFR. At that moment, I just blacked out and woke up in a hospital with a ton of stitches in my head. When I eventually got out, I asked my neighbor what he saw that night, and he just replied, "A bear." We get them often up here. I'm not entirely convinced that I was nearly beaten to death with my own gun by a bear. Hey Joel, I've been a big fan for a while now, and thankfully I've never had anything happen to me that might necessitate the writing of a scary story. But then recently, I asked my mom about an unusual memory that I had from my childhood, which I then found out was just the tip of the iceberg. Now from memory, my version of the story goes kinda like this. This happened when I was 8 years old, so Thanksgiving, 1993. Me and my family drove way across the state to spend the night with my aunt and uncle at my mom's side. I was close with my cousins on that side of the family, and my mom and her sister were really close too, so we tended to spend a lot of holidays together. We drove over to their place. I remember playing with my cousins for a few hours, then we all sat down to dinner after being summoned by my mom and aunt. We all sat down, loaded up our plates, and the last thing I remember is my mom and my aunt telling us that we were going to have dinner in the upstairs bedrooms. I have this distinct recollection of not wanting to eat my food upstairs, but then my mom said, anyone who eats their turkey upstairs gets to watch the Mighty Ducks on the big TV in the mommy and daddy bedroom, okay? And that was all that needed to be said, and we were all up in her bedroom before we could say, attack the puck. My mom laid out a blanket for us, put all of our plates down on it, then we just sat there, perfectly content. Mom stayed with us, but she didn't need anything. Whenever we needed to use the bathroom, she would walk us there and back, but then anytime we wanted to go downstairs for any reason, she'd tell us to wait where we were, and then she returned with whatever it was that we wanted. The way I remembered it, it was the best Thanksgiving ever. We got to eat dessert up there too. We watched a whole bunch of other movies, and then we all fell asleep in my aunt and uncle's bed before driving back home sometime the next morning. And that's where my memory of the event ends. And like I said, for the longest time, I remember nothing except how cool it was to be able to watch the Mighty Ducks while eating my turkey. I somehow knew it was an exception. We asked if we could do the same thing in the years that followed, and were always told no. But then last year, I just so happened to ask my dad about that Thanksgiving and why. Just for 1 year we got to eat in front of the TV. And I remember he gave me this look, and it being one that I didn't recognize. I feel like we were all used to seeing our dads with like 3 basic facial expressions. The first is that I'm not mad right now, but I'm ready for something kind of look, with the second being straight up mad, and the third being my sports team, just won a game kind of smile. But that day, my dad gave me this look that I could only interpret as fear. Whatever the answer to my question was, it wasn't some half-buried memory made fuzzy by too many blue ribbons. It was something he remembered very well, and was something that frightened him. He let out a big sigh and told me, "Don't tell your mom I told you this," and then went into the grown-ups version of events, which is as follows. So everything I told you to start with still stands, and by that I mean everything was going fine until we sat down to dinner. Then as we were eating, the phone started to ring. My uncle got up to answer the call, and it was a man asking for my aunt. So he calls her to the phone, and then sits back down to eat. A minute or two later, my aunt comes back in, but she's quiet and she's not touching her food. My uncle asked her what's wrong, but she tells him she's fine. It was just someone from work calling or some other excuse which got him to drop it. Then another minute or two goes by, and the grown-up starts seeing a car's headlights turn into my aunt and uncle's driveway. They're not expecting any other guests, but it was Thanksgiving, so it wasn't out of the question that someone might stop over unexpectedly. But instead of just acting curious like the rest of the grown-ups, my dad said that he watched the color drain from my aunt's face. My uncle was halfway to getting up from his seat, and my dad said my aunt grabbed him by the arm and said 3 hushed words that had the color draining from his face too. "Get your gun," she said. Obviously, my mom and dad wanted to know what the hell was happening, but there was no time to really explain. All my aunt told them was that we might all be in a lot of danger, at which point my mom started gathering up us kids and taking us upstairs. We'd all been sitting at the kids' table at the time, and although it was right there next to the adults' table, I don't remember anything except the moment my mom told me to go upstairs. As I've already told you, she then stayed upstairs with us, making sure that we didn't see anything or hear anything of what happened next, but then headed up by my uncle, and my dad and aunt went to see who'd showed up unexpectedly. Having listened to the advice of my aunt, my uncle had his .45 ready to rock, but later said that he had no idea who was out there or why my aunt was so scared, and all the unanswered questions had him just as scared as she was. But still, he did what he had to and walked outside with his gun ready to go. According to my dad, they walked outside and they can't see anything right away because the guy's headlights are shining bright and just blinding them. But then they take a few steps off the porch and their security light lit up the stranger's car. My dad said he could see the guy standing behind his open trunk, but he couldn't see his face at all at first. Meanwhile, my uncle was marching towards the guy asking him to identify himself, and the guy steps out from behind his car holding his gun. My aunt screamed, then ran back inside, but my dad said that he was frozen knowing that if this random gun-toting stranger shot my uncle, he'd have to try and rush him from the side, because there was no way he was going to let some maniac gun into his house where his kids were upstairs. But my dad also said that around about the same time he saw the gun, he noticed something about the guy holding it. He was drunk as a skunk. He didn't so much as step out from behind the car as stumble out from behind it, and as my uncle approached him, the guy looked like he had no idea how to use the gun he was holding. My uncle raised his own and kept telling him, "You point that thing at me and I'll kill you." And by some miracle, the stranger either couldn't load the thing properly or couldn't get a good grip on the side, because my uncle made it all the way over to him to knock him out before he could even look up. Dad said it was a nasty hit too, but even so, he'd never been so relieved in his entire life. After that, my dad rushed him, disarmed the stranger for good. Then he and my uncle basically sat on the guy until the cops showed up. I say sat on the guy more like sat with him, because when he woke up from being knocked out, he had next to no idea where he was, and was so out of it that he didn't even try to get up until he saw the lights of the sheriff's deputies approaching my aunt and uncle's house. The deputies cuffed the guy, then took him away, and all the while me and my cousins are up in the back bedroom, completely none the wiser that any of this was happening. Like I already said, Mom stayed with us until bedtime, and I remember my aunt and uncle coming in to say goodnight too. Now looking back on it, they were as cool and calm as anything, not even a hint of what had just unfolded downstairs. But after we went to sleep, it was a different story. My aunt told my mom, dad, and uncle for the very first time the story of why she'd packed up and moved away from her home city. And it was all because of some psycho that she'd made the mistake of getting hitched to. He didn't hit her, he wasn't a violent man, which made sense after the sorry display that he'd made with the pistol. But he found other ways to make her life absolutely terrible. At first, she didn't need to work because he could take care of her, and she didn't need her own checking accounts because why would she? My aunt was too naive to realize that, when her ex-husband turned bad, not having her own money would mean that she was basically stranded. Her ex took the phone out of the house, threw all the food out one at a time, then left her alone for a night, and she had to beg on the street for the payphone money to call my grandma to come rescue her. She was so ashamed of having gotten into that situation, of having been so stupid as she put it, that she swore my grandma to secrecy, and it was a secret that she took to her grave with her. And sometime after, my aunt moved to Chicago to be closer to my sister, met my uncle, and the rest is history. She thought that she'd left that whole sad chapter of her life behind, and after 10 years of not hearing from him, she had no idea if her ex was dead or alive. Not until he showed up at her house early on that Thanksgiving evening with a gun and 2 gallons of gas in his trunk to burn the house down after he'd shot us all. At least, that was his plan. The guy ended up going to prison, not for as long as anyone would have liked him to, but if he steps foot back in the town my aunt and uncle live in, not Chicago, by the way, then he'll go straight back to prison, no questions asked. Obviously, 30 years have gone by, and my parents and aunt are all in their 70s by now. That means that her ex is going to be around that age too, and hopefully he's somehow found a way to make peace with the whole thing, and he's not going to try and reach out again. But that's the thing that actually frightens me about this whole story. It's not actually over yet. Everyone just kind of assumes that he's not going to show up again, mostly on account of how old he'll be. But from where I'm standing, it looks a lot more like hope than assumption. They're all just hoping this guy isn't going to show up again, and the idea that there's some impending family tragedy on the horizon. It makes me feel like there's a blade hanging over my neck, just waiting to drop at any time. I'm scared what my aunt went through twice will only really ever be over when her ex is dead. At least I hope so, because God knows I don't want it to end with anyone else dying except him. Something like 10 years ago, I got my first ever dog, a toy-sized poodle puppy. She was way cute and also way too smart for her own good. She quickly learned that little kids, elderly ladies, and people who wore pink and sparkly stuff loved puppies, so much that she could get people food from them. One day, she escapes the yard while I'm vacuuming the house, and I end up going all over searching. I started on foot, then decided that she must have gone far, maybe got out right when I started. And so I got into my car and started driving all over the neighborhood, calling for her and showing people walking by pictures of her and asking if they'd seen my puppy. As I'm driving around hollering for her, I see some kids on their lawn playing with Barbies. They look 5 to 6 years old maybe, and they hear me calling for my pup and come running up to ask what kind of puppy I lost. I was going to show them my phone picture, and then realize that this is the exact scenario they use to teach stranger danger. So instead, I was like, go get your parents, I need to talk to them. One girl did, but the other stood there, even put her hands on the windowsill of my car, and asked if I had the puppy in the car. At the time, my only thought was for the parents to hurry up because I really didn't know what to do. So the mom comes out and has a total panic over her child being right up at a stranger's car and comes running over. I explain to her that I lost my dog, and I give her my number and show her the picture, but I doubt she believed any of it because she just scooped up her kids and carried them into the house. I just wanted to share this story because that day, I was the creep. And if you're wondering if I have found my puppy, I did. Or rather, a neighbor did. She had gone into his chicken coop and fallen asleep in a nest full of eggs and got sat on by the mama bird. When he went to collect the eggs, he was surprised to find a very waggy-tailed chick. I don't really have an explanation for what happened. I have ideas, but here's the story. I'm a freshly graduated high school student on my way to college. During my senior year, I had a job working for my grandfather as a farmhand, more or less a farm manager. He would give me instructions on what to do on the farm without him being there, most commonly feeding the cows. It was early November, and at this time, baseball practice started after school and would last from 3.25 to 5.30. By that time, the sun was almost down when I arrived at work and started getting ready. One day, I had gotten dressed, filled up the buckets, and fed the first farm when I realized that I didn't have a key to the other farm. Frustrated, I was forced to pick up 2 buckets at a time and walk them from the fence to the feed trough, a good 40-yard walk. While walking, I was trying to keep myself upbeat and just started to whistle. No real pattern or tune, just something that I came up with. When I came back and put the last buckets in the bed of the truck, I heard something from my neighboring property. It was whistling. Strange, I thought, as no one lives anywhere near that property, and it sounded very close. I rationalized it was a mockingbird or something, and just kind of went on with my life. The next couple of days, I didn't whistle, but the whistling continued. Slowly, over those few days, it got clearer and clearer until it sounded like regular whistling. Eventually, it got louder. When I first heard it, it was very faint. I almost missed it over the crunching of me walking to my truck. In the last few days, I kind of became accustomed to the whistling and kind of expected it. When one day it didn't come, I was a little disappointed. This time, I had brought the key and walked up to the gate and started fiddling with my keys when I dropped them into the grass. I said, damn it, when I dropped them. I squatted down and started to search for them when I heard a very faint sound coming from the other property. A low groan or gurgle, and it was getting louder. At this point, I wasn't scared but more curious as to what was going on over there. I left my truck parked across from the property and walked a few feet down the road and hopped the fence at the property where I heard the sounds. The land in there goes straight uphill and is heavily wooded all throughout, and the further you go up, the more dense it gets. Looking back now, I made a few big mistakes that could have gotten me hurt. As I walked up the hill, I would occasionally hear the gurgle. It was far up the hill, so still as faint as it was before. As I walked, a bad smell started to hit my nose, a weird mixture of garbage and wet dog or something. I heard something as I was about to crest the hill. Damn it! A very dry, low and quite distorted damn. It came from a couple of yards in front of me. It sounded like a 60-year-old smoker saying damn it very slowly, as if they didn't know English or something. I automatically thought someone was on our property, somewhat angry and paranoid now. I started to move slower. I didn't want this guy to hear me before I could see them. I kept going and stopped and listened when I heard another sound. Damn it, damn it, damn it. This guy was now slowly saying damn it normally, not long and drawn out in that eerie way, as if he didn't know English. I sat down on this log, kind of listening, trying to figure out what I should do about this person. He kept saying it over and over, and I noticed his tone was getting higher and his inflection was changing, and it hit me. This guy was perfectly mimicking me, my tone, inflection, literally everything. He even mimicked my frustration when I said it. Angry and kind of scared now, I got up and started to crest the hill. I flicked on my flashlight on my phone. Hey, this is private property. I was cut off mid-sentence. As I came over the hill, the light barely illuminated this naked figure squatting just a couple of yards in front of me. His eyes were illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight. I automatically felt that something was wrong. This wasn't a regular person. His neck was longer than normal, and when I came up the hill, he winched his neck and snapped his head to look at me without moving. His eyes were too big, and his head was large and slender. He was squatted in a ballerina-type squat. I looked at his body. He was very skinny. His ribs were showing through his skin. There was a short silence, and like a robot, the man turned in the leaves and slowly stood with his hands next to his side. I was debating if it was even a person. It was far too tall to be a person. Damn it, it said in my voice. I turned and sprinted down the hill. It didn't feel like I was running, but more that my legs were just going through the motions. I didn't look back before I got to the fence, and when I hopped it, I got in my truck and sped away. Sadly, I still work at that farm, but I've never told anyone this story, not even my grandfather. I've only heard the whistling a few more times since then. I'm not really a believer in the paranormal, and I really try to find an explanation for weird stuff, and believe that this may have just been some weird squatter, but I really don't know. Thanksgiving is coming up, and I know you sometimes make videos based on whatever holiday is on the horizon, so I wanted to send my story in about that time of the year. You see, I had a great childhood. I know that in the age of people wearing their traumas on their sleeve, that's not a very cool thing to admit, but it's true. I don't have any issues with my mom or dad, who were still together after 40+ years of marriage. Neither was I bullied at school, and unlike my two best friends growing up who had liver problems and diabetes respectively, I never had any chronic medical issues to deal with, and I used to think that I was lucky. Everyone seemed to have some messed up thing going on in their family, be it a divorce, a sibling or parent with a drug or alcohol problem, anything that meant that they were broody and world-weary by the time we hit high school. But I didn't, and on top of that, I couldn't exactly see anything on the horizon either. But during Thanksgiving of 2005, when I was 15 years old, I found out that everything in my family wasn't exactly perfect either. So I have an uncle that's almost 20 years younger than my dad. Dad was an only child all through his teenage years. Then one day he got the news that his little brother was on the way. My grandparents always said my uncle was an unexpected blessing, which I guess means he was an accident. But then with him being the baby of the family, he was doted on and spoiled like it was nobody's business. And this ended up with my dad and uncle being worlds apart in terms of age, but also worlds apart in terms of personality too. My dad spent a few years in the Marine Corps, and he wasn't like Jocko or anything like that, but it definitely stuck with him. Whereas my uncle was a struggling musician, then a struggling artist, and then a struggling writer, all because my grandparents blew so much hot air up his, but that he thought that ambition could just trump talent. I always thought he was a cool guy, and I could never understand why my dad gave him such a hard time. He always seemed so laid back and chilled out, and I could talk to him about all the stuff my dad found boring or had no time for. I was always pleased to see him whenever he visited, and he and my dad never argued in front of me, which I appreciate looking back on, at least until the Thanksgiving that I'm about to tell you about. So one night, we're having dinner, and my dad tells my mom that my uncle is bringing his girlfriend over for Thanksgiving. I remember being excited to meet her, as anyone dating my uncle must be as cool as him, right? Mom and dad seemed kind of nervous, emphasis on kind of, but put it down to never having met her prior to some big family occasion. Cut to maybe a week or two later, and my uncle shows up for Thanksgiving and starts introducing his girlfriend to the whole family. She was very attractive, I'll say that much, but she was definitely out of place with her leather jacket and tattoos. Now, that being said, my family were as friendly as ever and tried their best to make her feel welcome. Dad made a toast, we ate dinner, then everyone kind of went their separate ways to do the after-dinner stuff. The men went to watch sports highlights, the women had coffee around the breakfast nook in the kitchen, and the younger kids played among themselves. But me, I went upstairs to my bedroom to play video games. I can't remember how long I played for, but it was mid-evening when I went downstairs to grab a soda, so maybe like 7:30 to 8 o'clock or something. I walked downstairs into the kitchen, and right by our refrigerator was the door to the garage. I opened up the fridge, grabbed a soda, then after I closed it and started walking out of the kitchen, I heard something coming from the garage. To my knowledge, everyone is either sitting around the TV or playing bridge in the dining room. There's no one left in the kitchen, and there definitely shouldn't have been anyone in the garage, so obviously the question was, who was in there and why? It could have easily been maybe a raccoon, I guess, but my biggest fear, the one that had me reaching for the door to take a peek outside, was the idea that someone had broken into our garage, the same garage that had direct access to a house full of totally unsuspecting people and myself. I remember reaching for the door handle real slow, then pulling it open real fast, and then just scanning the interior. Something caught my eye right away. It was my uncle's girlfriend. Her eyes just looked wrong. There was blood coming out of her nose and mouth, and at first I thought my uncle was trying to help her, but then right there with me watching, he hits her, and he hit her so hard that her head just jerked back in this weird ragdoll kind of way that I can still remember clear as day, even all these years later. And the second he did, I slammed the door closed and ran into the TV room and managed to get the attention of everyone there by just pointing towards the kitchen and saying, "Uncle Tony in the garage." His name isn't actually Tony, by the way. I just don't know how to describe the moment without dropping a name. Everyone ran to the garage. The cops were called, and within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, what had once been this nice family atmosphere had turned into total chaos, which spilled out into the streets and ended with my uncle in a cop car and his girl in an ambulance. I didn't get to see all that much before my mom and dad screamed at me to get up to my room. They were so angry that I thought that they were mad at me for a while, and afterwards, they explained something to me that I don't think childless people are even capable of conceiving. So much of what a parent does bears no other purpose than to protect their children. Sometimes a parent can come across as a total jerk, just a soulless, joyless husk that wants nothing more than to suck all the happiness out of their kid's life. I know there's times when parents overstep the line and genuinely are cruel and abusive to their kids, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the things that feel like punishments or restrictions that are actually nothing but manifestations of love and protection. And that's pretty much the reason my mom and dad shielded me from the truth about Uncle Tony. They didn't want to cut him off or have me resenting them for not allowing us to have a relationship, so they went about this difficult balancing act of allowing him to visit me without filling my head about stuff that he was doing in his life. Stuff like doing drugs, committing petty financial crimes, stealing from grandparents, and as I saw with my own eyes, being a complete piece of human garbage in how he chose to treat the women in his life. Which reminds me, like I said, Uncle Tony, again, not his real name, got picked up by the cops after my dad, and some neighbors basically beat the crap out of him and pinned him down in our driveway at that time. But his girlfriend, she had to stay in the hospital overnight. My uncle had beaten her pretty bad, and I think the doctors were scared that she had a concussion, but all she had was a broken nose and a busted lip, I guess. Mom and Dad paid her hospital bills, and Mom went to visit with her some time after, I'm guessing to ask about her pressing charges. And to this day, I still don't know for sure if my mom went over to talk her into it. She's always claimed that all she said was something like, "We'll support you no matter what your decision is," and that the girl went ahead and pressed charges all of her own free will. I'm not saying that's impossible, but I've heard way too many stories about battered wives and girlfriends being too afraid to talk to the cops for years before they suddenly snap and decide to do something themselves. And maybe that was the case with my uncle and his girl. Or maybe my mom knew that unless someone stepped in and encouraged her to do the right thing, the same pattern of misery and violence would just go on until someone either died or got sent to jail. Just to be clear, that's entirely speculation on my part, and I guess I'll take my mom's word for it that she didn't intervene or interfere. But either way, it went to court, and my uncle pled no contest, seeing as there were a ton of witnesses against him. And he ended up doing 3 years of a 6-year sentence, at which point my parents totally cut him off. And by that time, I was completely okay with him doing that, as I had absolutely no desire to see my Uncle Tony ever again. Now, I know I might sound kind of messed up, but for the first few days after it happened, I wasn't angry or horrified or appalled at what my uncle did. I was heartbroken. I couldn't believe someone that I looked up to so much was capable of doing something just so awful. I just couldn't make sense of it. In my mind, there had been some kind of terrible misunderstanding, and I still haven't really forgiven myself for thinking this. But I couldn't help but think this girl had done something to deserve it, I guess. Was she trying to steal something? Had he caught her doing drugs? There had to be some logical reason why my laid-back, incredibly cool uncle would do something so terrible. Spoilers, but there wasn't a reason. At least nothing that could possibly justify putting his hands on her in the way that he did. And I had to hear the whole thing from my mom, following her visit to the still recovering and now ex-girlfriend, to really understand what had happened. One of the things I wonder in the days after was why his girl hadn't screamed. If they were having a fight or whatever, then how had it gone from mere silence to physical violence without any kind of escalation in volume? That was just one of the reasons why I very naively thought that there must have been something more to the story, right up until my mom told me the following. She hadn't asked my uncle's ex the same question, not directly anyway. It just came out during my mom's retelling of her visit. My uncle's ex didn't scream when he started hitting her because she learned that if she did, he'd only hit her harder. And this did 2 things. Number 1, it gave me an idea of just how long the abuse had been going on for. And 2, it made me hate my uncle. And I mean really hate him. There was and is something so sickeningly sadistic about that one little detail, and once I had it in my head, there was no coming back from it. That was the uncle I didn't know I had. That was the version of my uncle that my parents tried to shield me from. I guess that's maybe an overdone concept with some of the stories that you probably get sent to you here. As in the old, I thought they were sweet, but they were actually a monster. But I also understand why they don't ever really get old either. It's something a lot of people go through in their lives, realizing that sometimes things aren't quite what they seem. But a lot of my school friends got that lesson way early, whereas I was way into my teenage years when I realized that sometimes you think you know someone when really, you don't know them at all. Firstly, I don't know what your policy is on this kind of thing, so feel free to leave it out if you really don't think it's necessary. But I'd like to give everyone a little trigger warning regarding the topic of taking your own life. I personally don't think I need them, but I've talked to enough people with these kind of ideations over the years to know that they're greatly appreciated by those who think they need them. So if you don't mind including this one, I think people would be very grateful. I guess I gave it away already, but you see, I'm struggling with these kind of thoughts for a long time. I ended up getting addicted to painkillers after a sports injury, and although I tried as hard as I possibly could to break the cycle and kick my habit, I kept on failing time and time again. Addiction counseling just didn't seem to work for me, and once I'd picked up street drugs a few times and knew my way around, keeping me away from opiates became harder and harder. In the end, I decided that the only way out, the only true way out, was to take my own life and stop being such a burden on absolutely everyone around me. I only made one solid attempt, and I survived, and after I ended up in the hospital, my parents were informed of what I'd tried to do. It was a sort of come-to-Jesus moment when I realized how far I'd fallen, and from then on we did things different. There were no more rehabs, no more treatment programs in the city. I was going out to the middle of nowhere, to where my mom and dad owned a little vacation cabin, and I was basically going to live there until opiates just weren't part of my thought process anymore. It was like a bridge between where I was and wherever I was going to go next, and although I didn't know where exactly that would be, I sure as hell knew that it wasn't going to involve any pills or powders that I couldn't buy at a mom-and-pop drugstore. I ended up staying at that cabin for 4 months, and it was in a real sorry state that I found it too. I guess that just showed my resolve though. Cleaning it gave me something to keep me occupied, and I guess the whole process is maybe good for the mind or something, because it definitely had this therapy-like quality to it that had an awesome effect on my peace of mind. So like I say, I made a house, a home so to speak, then ended up staying there for basically the whole of the fall, and then including Thanksgiving. I'd been there a while by that point, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't miss my family. In fact, I was just jonesing for some company all around. So when my mom and dad suggested driving up to visit with some turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sandwiches, I was in no position to turn them down. They traveled up, and we had a nice afternoon just hanging out, and then we all went to bed at a pretty early hour before rising just as early. I made us some eggs, they packed up their things, but before they left my parents asked if I wanted to go for a walk. It had been a while since they'd visited the cabin, so they figured that it'd be nice to just sort of reacquaint themselves with some of the old trails that we used to walk during our childhood vacations. I remember the old route because it led up to this big iron bridge that ran high above a shallow stream. Walking across it always used to freak me out as a kid, because looking through the railings down into the stream gave me the willies in a big way, but the more we walked there the less freaked out I got, and eventually it became one of my favorite spots whenever we visited the cabin. So we got to going on our walk along those winding trails that went up and up until we reached the iron footbridge. Then when we got there we see this other guy standing by the railings looking over the edge. There are plenty of other cabins in the area, so I just figured this guy was doing the same thing we were. Taking a little walk maybe before or after dinner, just to clear his head and digest his turkey. We didn't call out to him or anything. I guess I figured that we just give him a friendly nod if we made eye contact while walking across the bridge. We also weren't talking very loudly. We were just enjoying the stillness of the forest, so I guess that had us talking in library voices or something. Go figure. Anyway, my point is this guy didn't see or hear us until we were almost right up on the bridge, and when he did I knew something was off just from the look he gave us. He got startled and had this sort of you-caught-me expression that I found really confusing at first, but then he did what he did, and that look made a chilling amount of sense. The second after the guy saw us, he threw himself off the bridge. My mom let out this really shocked gasp while my dad went to grab her, like he was trying to protect her from something that couldn't actually do her any physical harm. Me, on the other hand, I just ran forward towards where the guy had jumped. Looking back, I don't really know what I was thinking, and to be honest, I don't really know if I was really thinking at all. I guess it was just some gut reaction to try and stop the guy from falling. But he was in free fall by the time I even stepped foot onto the bridge. He didn't do it like 1 foot up the railing then jumped. He sort of rolled himself over, I guess to try his best to land on his head or his neck. But things didn't work out like that for him. He didn't get to go quick, and after I saw what remained of him, I've never been able to get that image out of my head. I don't want to go into too much detail and turn this into some big gross kind of affair, but just imagine what it would be like to somehow survive a fall that breaks dozens of bones, but still has you awake and feeling everything. The image was bad, but I honestly think the noises he was making were worse. He couldn't really scream. He was trying to. He was trying with all he could to express just how much agony he felt. But for some reason, probably in some part due to the devastation his body had just endured, he couldn't actually scream. The only sound he could make was this croaking noise like a big bullfrog, and he only made it 1 or 2 times before I ran back towards my parents to turn us back towards the cabin. Thankfully, the cell reception in the area wasn't too bad, which meant that my first 911 call connected just fine, and I was able to tell the dispatcher what had happened. A forest ranger was first on the scene, but by the time they got there the guy lying in the shallow stream had stopped making all of his terrible noises. I honestly think that even if the ranger had been there with his medical supplies the moment the guy jumped off the bridge, there still wouldn't have been a thing that we could do for him. He was a mess beyond saving, and I have no doubt that he died in absolute agony. I moved out of the cabin a month later, and although it wasn't the whole reason, witnessing that man take his life up near the bridge was definitely playing a part. It's not like I was having nightmares or anything either, and I really don't want to sound too self-absorbed here, because what happened to that guy is a tragedy all on its own, but I couldn't help but think to myself that could have been you down there, writhing in agony, trying and failing to scream your last scream, and I think that was the time that I knew that I was going to be okay, because the one thing that I was certain of is that I never want to end up like that guy. I know how it feels to be that desperate, but what I realized was that I never once considered that taking my own life would be a selfish thing to do. I thought the selfish thing was to try and carry on living, that it was cowardly to just go on living knowing that I was going to be an addict my whole life. But the truth is, choosing life is the bravest thing a person can do. Waking up, getting dressed, and going to face whatever life throws at you. That's the really difficult part, and there's personal glory in even the smallest of successes. And I wouldn't wish seeing a body like that on anyone, not even a dumb junkie like me, because now I do believe people can be haunted by the dead, not by some sort of apparition, but the ghost inside their head. For Thanksgiving of 2009, I took my family over to my sister's place. They lived in Chattanooga, which was a long drive from where we lived in Indianapolis, but I had no problem driving all that way to spend the holidays with my brother-in-law. He became my best friend during those early dad years, as I didn't really have anyone else to ask advice from. My own father passed away when I was a kid, and my friends who actually got it together and had families didn't do so until their 30s. So when it came to getting dad advice, he was the first person I turned to, and that little conversation evolved into one of the closest friendships of my life. So we got there, he cooked us an amazing dinner, but afterwards he complained that he wasn't feeling so hot. He went to the bathroom, then came back saying that there was fluid coming out of his ear, but was also quick to reassure us that he'd struggled with ear infections in the past, and that it wasn't anything we needed to worry about. The night went on perfectly normal after that. We put the kids to bed at around 9 before adult bedtime, ended up being around 11:30 to midnight. But then around 1 a.m. my sister wakes up to her husband trembling and sweating in the bed next to her, saying that he felt like he had a fever. He goes to the bathroom, takes some medication, but he's still awake and shivering at around 3 a.m. with no signs of feeling any better. The next morning my sister got up early to take care of their boys and was mindful to be quiet so he could get some rest. I swung by in the morning with breakfast for them, and my sister informed me that he was still sleeping. Right away I thought that was weird, because he was never one to let a hangover keep him in bed, so I knew that he must have been feeling pretty terrible. The two of us left to leave him to get some rest, and tried to keep the noise from the boys to a minimum, and let my brother-in-law get some rest, as we all had plans that afternoon. Afternoon rolls around, and after calling a couple times, and them not picking up my wife, and I went by the house at around 2 to check on my sister and brother-in-law. The moment we got there I got this terrible feeling. When I stepped inside I took no satisfaction in finding out how right I was. The moment my sister opened the door she was white as a ghost, as she told me to follow her upstairs because she desperately needed help. We sprint up the stairs to find my brother-in-law breathing extremely erratically, with all this bright green snot coming out of his nose. My sister was shaking him to get him to wake up, and you could hear the fluid in his lungs as he was breathing in. As I started trying to wake him up, my sister ran over to get water to pour on his face to rinse off the snot and try and startle him awake, and at that point he stopped breathing. I looked up at my sister, and we both knew that things were getting wildly serious, and we had to act quick. She was fortunate to have had a few CPR lessons, so she started instructing me on exactly what needed to be done. We dragged him off the bed to the floor and started alternating breathing in his mouth and chest compressions, and this is when things started going from bad to worse. We screamed out to my wife to call 911 and have my mom get the kids out of the house. My wife then ran up the stairs on the phone to see the two of us performing CPR on him. As I did the CPR moves, a truly horrifying amount of blood started coming out of his mouth and nose, and this was something that I was completely unprepared for. I didn't even realize it was blood at first. It was dark brown, not like the movies and TV shows depict. So there I was bawling with my sister as the two of us were pounding on my brother-in-law's chest with my wife standing over us on the phone with the operator. I decide that I'm going to check on him, and with my thumb I open his eyelid. Big mistake. You cannot unsee that. Because I didn't focus, didn't move, didn't do anything, and I pulled my hand away. As I was still performing CPR, my sister runs around the bed to get shorts for my brother-in-law before the paramedics get there, so when they take him out he's just not completely nude. Now another thing, that I wasn't ready for my brother-in-law's bowels evacuating as we try to get his underwear on. Seconds later my sister is standing there cupping her hands over his stuff, crying as she's saying, "He's peeing, oh my God, he's peeing." I yell back that we're doing everything we can, and that it's going to be okay, but we both knew that things were not going to be okay. It was only a question of how bad they were about to get. The paramedics arrived, and the moment they did we got out of the way to let them work. At this point I was so relieved they just needed to get him to breathe and start his heart. This is the 21st century, right? They do this kind of thing daily, right? I thought. They started chest compressions and got him on monitors and a belt-looking thing that went around his chest and performed the compressions for them. It was a terrible thing to watch as it contracts and sends him heaving forwards and then back down over and over. We drape a sheet around his waist before they drag him down the stairs. I run to the bathroom, because I am now very aware of the taste in my mouth. It was like I had a mouthful of pennies and vomit. I rinsed out my mouth as they got him downstairs, and I soon found myself screaming, "Get the kids outside now." My wife takes them up and gets them to the back patio. Thankfully, they didn't see him the way he was, and we ran out the door and got to the hospital. The ambulance wasn't there yet, so I waited outside. As it arrived, they wheeled him to the door, chest still regularly heaving upwards, eyes still closed, and I ran back to the waiting room and told my sister and wife that he'd arrived. After that, all we could do was wait. What feels like hours go by, and they pull us into a small room, and the doctor comes to speak to us. The moment he asked if he could close the door, I just kind of knew. He informs us that they tried everything, but that my brother-in-law had passed away. I'm not totally sure what happened next. No tears at first, disbelief and confusion. My sister is hysterically crying, screaming that it's not supposed to be this way. They were supposed to grow old together, and I eventually lose it, and everyone was inconsolable. Things have since gotten better though, or at least more normal. But still I can barely believe it. The company I worked for was awesome about it, and they paid for grief counseling for my sister and I. Also, between friends and family, my sister received close to $20,000 that she is putting towards the boys' college funds. And you really find out who is important in your life really quickly. I have amazing friends and family, and wouldn't trade a single one for the world. We later found out that he had a nearly perfect storm of issues. Infection that manifested streptococcus, pneumonia, meningitis. He had a lung infection, ear infection, enlarged heart, and eventually septic shock. If I can give any advice to anyone that reads this or hears this, go to the doctor if you feel even remotely sick. Within 11 hours of shivering in bed, he was dead. Don't think about how you're going to pay for it, just tough it out. Because just 1 second with those you love is more valuable than any dollar amount. And I mean any. My brother-in-law was a healthy guy too. He worked out regularly, did jiu-jitsu, biked everywhere, cooked all of his meals from organic fruits and vegetables, did yoga, and was only 39 years young when he passed. He was a magnificent human being, an amazing martial artist, and a wonderful father. And he will be missed. When I was just 11 years old, my dad and I went for a walk just before Thanksgiving dinner. We lived just north of Columbus back then in a little suburb called Shawnee Hills. It was a great place to grow up, and we had a big house with my own bedroom and a big backyard too. At the end of this backyard was a small gate, and beyond that was a whole bunch of woods, and then a deep, fast-flowing river that's probably still popular with summertime kayakers. I remember being incredibly hungry, but dinner wasn't going to be ready for another hour or so. So instead of sitting in front of the TV, moping, my dad offered to take me on a walk to the river. Walking down there to throw twigs and stones into the water was one of my favorite things to do, mainly because I was never allowed to do it on my own. I have a real vivid memory of throwing larger stones into the water and finding the big plump that they made upon splashing into the current to be extremely satisfying. Plus, as my dad said, if we used up the last of the daylight to walk down there, toss a few stones, and then walk back, then dinner would be on the table just seconds after we arrived back. It seemed like a flawless plan at the time, so I accepted his offer, and off we went. We walked all the way down to the stream, shining flashlights even though it was still half light outside. Then when we got there, I did my usual thing of looking around for the biggest rocks possible. My dad joined in, and for the next few minutes we're picking them up and tossing them into the river until my dad comes across one that looks particularly promising. I remember him distinctly saying, "We got a big one here," and then he took a step up onto one of the rocks at the edge of the river and kicked one of his feet against the one next to it, I guess to try and dislodge a piece that was cracked and coming away. Then in one fluid motion he slipped, hit the rock that he'd been standing on, then went crashing into the water. It sounds so perversely awful to think about it now, but at the time, I actually thought it was kind of funny. He slipped, and when he hit the rock on his side, he made this funny sort of sound, and then after he fell into the water, I honestly thought he'd just pull himself out right away, just like he did whenever he jumped into our swimming pool in the summer. Only problem was he didn't, and as I walked up to the river's edge, I caught a glimpse of him floating away downstream. Recalling that moment has suddenly made this very difficult to write about, so excuse me if the quality of my writing just takes a sudden turn. But seeing him floating away, or rather, seeing a flash of the fabric of the jacket that he was wearing just bobbing in the water as the fast-flowing river took him further and further away, that's what made me realize that something was wrong. And that's what had me running down the riverbank, desperately calling out his name, and wondering why he wouldn't answer. The more I ran, the more I started to cry, and by the time he was truly out of sight and I couldn't run anymore, I completely fell apart. I didn't want to accept that he was gone, but at the same time, something in my gut just told me that he was dead. But that didn't stop me from running for help, and I ended up running all the way to my neighbor's yard, where they called 911 and carried me back home to my mom. Again, the memories of what happened next are difficult to recall, not in the sense that they're hazy, but because I can still remember how painful it was. The worst part was seeing my mom and older sister, hoping that somehow my dad had survived lying unconscious in a freezing cold river for who knows how long. I wanted to share that hope so badly, but I couldn't. I think part of me always knew that he was never coming back, so getting news that his body had been found wasn't quite as devastating to me as it was to my mom and sister. But it still almost destroyed our family, and even after all these years of trying to process it, through therapy and self-help books or religion and booze, we're still not really over what happened that Thanksgiving. It's something I think about every single day, without fail, and somehow even the smallest, most inconspicuous little things bring the memories right back to me, sometimes at distressingly short notice. I guess this isn't the kind of story you're used to receiving as a submission, and I can understand why some people might think that this is more sad or tragic than outright horrifying. But to me, when I think of horror, true horror, I think of that moment when I realized that my dad wasn't okay. I think about that flash of his jacket that I saw floating in the water, and how quickly the current was dragging his unconscious body downstream. Sometimes I think I'd happily swap that memory for 1,000 nightly visits from Freddy Krueger, and I'd happily share my apartment with a ghost or two, even more so if they'd help me with the utilities. Anything to get that picture out of my head, anything to have an actual goodbye with a man that I never had a chance to really know. This happened when I was 13, on Thanksgiving of 2011, but it feels like a while ago. You see, after dinner, I was sitting at the top of the hill not far from my house. At the base of the hill, there were trees that went along the edge of the school. Kids would often start at the top of the hill and race down, with the first to cross through the trees being the winner. A simple game made fun by putting a steep hill in the mix. Well, I was all by myself and felt like doing it anyway, so I stood up and ran down that hill as fast as my legs could go. I was the fastest kid in the world at that moment. The next thing I knew, I was in the ground looking at the sky, and it felt like someone had taken a sword to my neck. I felt it, looked at my hands, and saw blood. A lot of blood. I focused my eyes and saw it tied between the two trees that I ran through. A fishing line, about 3 stands worth twisted together to give it strength. And I stared at that fishing line so confused. Why? What? How? And that's when I heard them. Maybe 20 feet away, a group of what looked like 8th or 9th graders who I had seen around the school sitting on their bikes, pointing and laughing. I could hear one distinctly say, "I can't believe he didn't see it. What an idiot." I never figured out who they were, but they were the reason why I was in pain, and they were the reason why I was bleeding. I didn't know any of them. I'd never done anything to deserve anything from them. But still, they'd chosen to do it, out of some pure malicious sense of boredom. I was so confused and in so much pain, but worst of all, I was scared that they weren't finished with me. I got up and ran with everything left in me down the back towards my house. I ended up tripping over the curb in front of the White Hen Pantry, which is now a 7-Eleven. I was lucky and saw some lady that helped me back up, and she dragged me inside and bought me some bandages and patched me up and told me to go home. I didn't trust anyone for a long time after that, and refused to do anything without first slowly and cautiously inspecting everything before I let myself even have any fun. Almost having my head cut off truly did ruin my carefree childhood days. This is a story of someone I knew and had cut ties with because he was a psycho. The first half will be to add context as to why I cut him off, and the second half is what makes it a let's not meet. I don't know if he uses Reddit, so I'll omit ages and locations. It started about 4 years ago when I was living in a friend's house while attending a nearby university. It was myself, my friend, his sister, and their parents. Roughly about 2 weeks into staying there, my friend's sister invited her boyfriend to live in the house too. And by all accounts, he was a pretty cool guy at first. Very sociable and full of great stories. We often sat around the table for drinks or talked about life, having a smoke in the garden. Within the first month, however, as he started to get comfortable, cracks started to show in this veneer. He would rant about government conspiracy, how he was always a wrong party. He was big into Sigma male nonsense and martial arts, and Christ did he have a temper. He had this big dog he always kept in a cage that was extremely violent when he wasn't around. The dog attacked his girlfriend and had to be put down, and that's when the guilt trips towards her began and the ranting became incessant. About 2 months later, he had the bright idea to live in a shipping container, mainly because the parents wanted him out and dragged his girlfriend along for the ride. I'm not talking about one of those chic little restoration jobs. This was a rented container in a storage yard among the outskirts of the town we were living in. He would intimidate and threaten the staff there constantly until they called the police. This, of course, was another conspiracy, and he became increasingly abusive to his girlfriend to the point where the family got involved to get her out of there. I stuck close to them, having to pretend to be on his side until we could safely get her out. They broke up, which he blamed me for, claiming that I was poisoning her against him to make her mine, and she has a new partner now, and they're happy. We all blocked the psycho ex on everything possible, but he continued to harass them until eventually he disappeared, or so we thought. Fast forward to last year. I started to receive messages over social media from several different accounts, blocking each one in turn when I discovered who it was. Some friendly and some hostile, and one of these profiles, however, was pretending to be someone I knew from university. We talked about life and how things were going, and eventually I was invited to a house party, claiming that it was a free house and plenty of people were coming. I booked the time off of work, made my travel plans, and kept talking to this friend coming to the date of the party. I mentioned it to my friend's sister, and she was interested in going herself, until I mentioned the address and she began to panic. The address in question was a property belonging to the crazy ex's father that was scheduled for sale. I waited until the date of the party and called the police to check the property, claiming a suspected break-in. They found 5 people there, including the ex. Parked out front was a butcher's van equipped for food storage and a collection of knives, hammers, and rope. Let's just say, I'm glad I didn't go. I was shopping with my toddler when an older lady, maybe around 70 years old, who was by herself, came up and said, "Ma'am, just so you know, all canned veggies are on sale for 50 cents this week," and went on about how it's a great deal and they don't run it often. I replied, "Thanks, I appreciate the heads up, and I'll definitely grab a few on my way out." She began to walk away, almost out of sight, and she stopped and looked back, smiling at my son. She then asked how old he was, and I responded, "Oh, he's just over a year." She then asked if he was my only child, and some other random questions about him. Then she said, "Hey, I just remembered, I have some clothes in my trunk, all boy stuff in your kid's range," and she asked if I wanted them. I politely declined, saying, "We'll be shopping for a while, I don't want to hold you up." She insisted, "Oh, not a problem, I'll just wait outside, and then I can come back in and find you before you leave. Are you a single mom? Would you need them?" I got this gut feeling that something was just off about this lady, so I said, "Nope, I'm not a single mom, and we have all the clothes we need." I thanked her for the offer. She tried a few more times, saying things like, "I just don't know what to do with them. If you could use them, I'd be happy to give them to you." At this point, it really felt like she was trying to lure me and my son to her car. I continued to decline the offer and walked away. I did a few more laps around the store, looking for things I needed. At one point I saw her standing in an aisle in the center of the store with a younger man, just sort of people watching. I could just be super paranoid, and she was just a sweet old lady trying to be nice, but something in my gut told me to get out of that conversation as quickly as possible. I feel like parents will know that having a small child with you makes strangers talk to you all the time and make small talk about your sweet kiddos. But this conversation did not feel the same as the others I've had while out and about with my son. Has anyone else had a similar experience? This happened when my best friend was 17 and a half, and I was 17 in 1996. My best friend Chrissy and I are both smaller females. She's 5 feet 4 inches, and at the time weighed 110 pounds, but was a soccer player, very athletic and strong. I'm 5 feet 7 inches, and at the time I weighed 125. We were both blue-eyed blondes, and were often asked if we were sisters or cousins. There was a large reservoir on the outskirts of her town, surrounded by a beautiful public park. We figured that we'd be fine to walk around in the park, because of lots of people usually hiking there. I had gotten some really good quality weed, and we were looking forward to finding a peaceful place to smoke, someplace out in nature. I had my pipe ready in my pocket, and we were pretty stoked. We chose to go out on a Saturday. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and there weren't too many people out there. We parked our car by the reservoir in the mostly vacant lot that had 2 other cars. We didn't see anybody when we got there. We walked around the water for a bit, and then chose a trail to go up. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit out, and we were sweating, but we had some water in my small day pack. As we got about a quarter mile or so into the trail, I started having a weird feeling. I looked at her and quietly asked, "Hey, do you feel something off here?" Everything's really quiet. Where there were usually crickets chirping and frogs singing, it was totally silent out. She looked at me and said, "Yeah, I think so," and then we heard some crackling of leaves about 60 feet behind us and a bit to the left. We didn't see anybody at the time, so we continued forward. We were both getting pretty nervous, and we heard the crackling again, this time a little bit closer. We still didn't see anyone, and each time we would continue forward, we would hear footsteps a little more behind us, and I thought that we were being stalked. There was a turnoff to the left, which led to a clearing by a large rock about 12 feet high, with a large sturdy rope anchored onto it to climb up to the top. It was part of a steep hillside of the cliff. The rope to climb it was anchored to the ground as well, so one could not move it, and I told her, "We need to get up that rock now. I think we need the high ground." She nodded, and went up first with me right behind her. We flew up that rock, clinging to the rope tightly, and going as fast as we could. When we reached the top, we turned around to see an older man, probably about 45, with a slighter build, wearing a jacket, jeans, and glasses coming into the clearing. He was about 20 feet away. He looked at us with a cold, vacant expression. I got goosebumps looking at him, so I shouted, "Hi, will you please leave us alone? We're just trying to have some privacy up here." He didn't respond, and with a blank expression slowly started walking towards the rope, which led to the top of the rock. My friend at this point was really scared, and asked, "What do we do?" I saw a large rock, about 8 inches and almost square to my right, so I grabbed it. I was surprised at how heavy it was, but my adrenaline was going, so I lifted it pretty easily, and I told her, "Look around for the biggest rock you can find fast. Move them next to us. Hold the biggest one, and if the guy tries to come up, we throw them at him and hit him as hard as we can. Aim for his head." Fortunately, there was a pile of sizable rocks behind us to the left, like someone had made a ring to hold a fire on top of the rock and then moved them away. She brought a few over and held a large one to herself. My friend and I stood close to the edge of the rock, holding our makeshift weapons. I looked down to the base of the rock where the guy was considering the rope. He looked up at us again with very cold blue eyes and no expression, and then he reached his hand for the rope. I shouted loudly, "Do not come up here. If you try to come up here, you're going to get hurt." I held the rock close to my chest so he could see it. My friend was next to me doing the same thing, and we had a pile of more rocks. He blinked his eyes and cocked his head a little bit, and then released his hand from the rope and silently backed away. He backed to the edge of the clearing, back through the bush, still watching us, and then we heard his crunching footsteps go back through the woods until we couldn't hear him anymore. We stayed on the rock for another 20 minutes, maybe a bit more, watching and waiting. There was no other way to access the rock except for the steep hillside covered with poison oak, so we didn't think he'd try it, and plus we'd be able to hear him if he did. After we didn't hear anything for 20 minutes, we decided to make a break for a car. We threw several rocks down to the ground. Mine hit the dirt with a particularly satisfying thud. Chrissy went first down when I was keeping watch in case he came back. When I was scaling down the rock, she was holding a rock, getting ready to throw it full force if he returned, and fortunately he did not. We each grabbed the largest rock we could carry, put a few smaller ones in our pockets for good measure, then headed back to our car on the trail very carefully and quietly. The crickets were chirping again, so we felt that he had left, but we were still extremely cautious. We did make it back to our car without incident and quickly left, and that was the last time I've ever hiked in that park. This happened when I was 10 years old. I was at a ski resort with my dad, stepmom, and 3 sisters. When this happened, my 2 sisters, dad and stepmom, were still out skiing, but my sister Ava and I got cold, so we went back to the hotel to get some food. We sat at the restaurant in the hotel until my stepmom came down. We asked her if she could hold the table, so we could quickly go up to the room to drop off our ski jackets. So we took the elevator, and once we got off, we started to walk to our room. That's when I heard someone behind me say, "Hey." Now keep in mind we were both about 11 at the time. I didn't think he was talking to us, so I just ignored it. We walked into our room, but before we could close the door, the man stepped into the doorway. He was tall, probably about 6 feet, and looked pretty old, maybe in his early 60s or late 50s. He was wearing the hotel staff uniform, but without the logos. The thing that raised a big red flag was that he was wearing black surgical gloves. He goes on to say, "Hey, I was talking to you." We spun around, caught off guard. "Ava saying us?" And he replies, "Yes, you. I was wondering if you could grab a picture for me and come into my room to pour some water for me." Our parents always told us never to trust strangers, and we already got a bad vibe from him, so we politely declined. His tone then got a bit annoyed, and he said, "It'll just take a second. Can you just come pour me some water in my room?" At this point, we already knew this wasn't right, so we just said no again. This conversation went back and forth for about 3 minutes until we tried to walk into our room. Our instincts kicked in at this point, and I ran towards the door saying, "Sir, we're good," and I slammed the door on him. Ava and I sat in the hotel room for about 10 minutes, panicking about how we were going to talk to our parents because we left our phones downstairs. We looked out the peephole, and he was gone, so we bolted down the hallway and ran back down the stairs to the restaurant. Once we told our stepmom, she was mortified and went to the office security. They interviewed us and asked us for a description because they didn't have any cameras in the hallway. We gave them the description, and they told us that nobody with that description works there and that most of them were young, broke college students. At this point, it really set in that if I accepted and just helped him, I might have died. As a teenager, I waited tables in a local restaurant to pay for the gas for my car. I met Mr. Creep there. In my naive mind, he seemed normal at first, despite the fact that he was 20 and wanting to date a teenager like me. Leaving my job after dark scared me, so I taught myself to get in my car, shut the door, and lock it in one fluid motion. It made me feel safe. One night, I was leaving work and had just gotten into my car when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere, yanking my door handle to try and open it. I looked into his eyes in the split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled my bones. I don't know how to describe the evil that I saw, and from then on I was terrified of him, but I didn't let on because I was afraid what he might do if I told him that I never wanted to see him again. And after this, he constantly lied to try and impress me and try to invent ways of being alone with me, but my instinct was to run, so I avoided him. About 2 weeks after this incident, the restaurant got robbed, and there was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him. I sent all my text conversations with Mr. Creep to the police chief in hopes that it would help. Mr. Creep slithered away after that, but I always looked over my shoulder. About 5 years ago, he messaged me on Facebook out of the blue. They went on about this top-secret military clearance as well as a huge acreage that he owned. It made me nervous, and I felt like he was trying to spring a trap or something, but I tried to put it out of my mind. Then today, I was looking at posts about an unsolved murder when I saw his mugshot. He is now facing murder charges, as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I'm just so glad to know that he's locked up, but so overwhelmed about how correct my instincts were about the guy I worked with. I, a mid-20s female, went to the local grocery store tonight at around 5 p.m. It's winter and getting dark by 5 where I live. I was in an aisle, taking my time deciding between the options when this late 20s, early 30s looking guy with light features, glasses, and a scruffy beard comes right next to me and just stands there. I didn't think much of it or even look at him at first because I figured, whatever, he's just looking too. But then after a few seconds, I noticed that he wasn't moving or doing anything, just standing there. So I looked at him, and he was already staring at me, and for half a second I thought that he might say something. So I stood there for a second just looking back at him, and he didn't say anything, so I just turned and walked fast away. At this point I'm thinking, okay, that was weird, but whatever. Probably just an awkward guy who doesn't know how to talk to women. Then not 30 seconds later, I'm in another aisle, and I see him out of the corner of my eye coming down the aisle I'm in, again, staring right at me. So again, I walked away as fast as I could, and just went right to the self-checkout. While I was at self-checkout, I'm looking over my shoulders the whole time, making sure that he isn't behind me anymore, and he's not. I start walking out of the store, relieved that once again I was just being paranoid, and I wasn't ever in any real danger. As I'm walking out, I decide to look behind me one more time, and there he is, right behind me. I then notice that he has nothing in his hands, no groceries, and he's heading towards the door right on my heels. Without even thinking, I just stop dead in my tracks. I look right at him again, and he's already looking at me, and then he puts his head down looking at his phone, and walks past me out the door. He bought nothing. I'm so scared at this point my head is spinning. I don't know what to do. I can see my car because I parked close to the exit, thank goodness. So I call my fiancée and sprint as fast as I can to my car. I jump in, lock the doors, and start looking for this dude. Then I see him. He's aimlessly walking around the parking lot through the cars. He's pretty far away from me at this point, and I have my fiancée on the phone, so I'm feeling somewhat safe again. I watched him walk around for another few seconds before I got out of there. I have no idea what this guy was doing or what his motive could have been. Maybe he was just a weird dude who doesn't know how to talk to girls, or maybe he was a predator with a dangerous intention, or maybe he thought I just looked like easy prey for a robbery. The thing I can't really wrap my head around is the fact that each time I noticed him, he was already staring at me. He was not discreet at all, and I would think a dangerous predator might be a little more inconspicuous. He also didn't buy anything from the grocery store, which I also can't understand. I was in the store about 5 minutes before I noticed him, so I'm sure that he didn't follow me in the store. Am I just being paranoid? There's a lot that didn't feel right, so I'm having a really hard time trying to rationalize this experience. It was definitely a creepy encounter. I'm currently an 18-year-old female, but this situation happened in 2021 when I was just 16. It was around 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and I was returning home from my tuition classes. At that time, there was a high spread of the pandemic, so the school was happening online. Still, I had no other option than to go and take notes from my teacher, because there was an important exam coming up. Normally, I wasn't allowed to go outside because my knowledge of roads and areas was pretty poor. However, my teacher's house was about 3 kilometers away and on the same route as our old apartment, so my parents allowed me to go. On the way there was a puchka stall, a popular, affordable, and delicious snack in our country, where I knew the shopkeeper since childhood. As I was walking home from my teacher's place after fetching the notes, I decided to snack on some of these puchkas and have a chat with the kind shopkeeper. The roads were somewhat empty at the time, with most of the shops closed and only a few passerby here and there. While I was eating, I suddenly felt someone touch my hair from behind, which startled me. I had a ponytail. When I turned around, I saw an old woman who appeared to be homeless, probably in her 60s or early 70s, smiling at me. She asked if I could buy her some snacks. At the time, I felt awkward and didn't know how to refuse, so I just said, yeah, sure, even though I didn't have enough money. I asked the kind shopkeeper to give her my share of the snacks that were left. I didn't really mind this, but as I was about to leave, she firmly grabbed my right hand and said, "God bless you, child. If I could see my granddaughter, she would be just like you," and so on. I was awkwardly smiling and nodding because I felt uncomfortable, and I did try to politely pull my hand away from her grip, but she didn't let go. Then she started talking about how she had raised her daughter and son, and how her husband, who was a rich man but a drunkard, used to mistreat and assault them. She explained how she had kept silent about it because of the money. Later, when her children grew up, got jobs and got married, her husband got into gambling, lost all of his money, went into debt, and eventually died of liver failure. Now, she was helpless and went to her children for help, but they resented her because they were greedy and refused to assist her. She shared how she had lost everything and went on for the next 2 hours. I sympathized with her, but I also realized that it was getting late to return home. The woman had a very eerie body language, and she started asking me about where I lived. Unfortunately, I told her about it at the time. She asked for my dad's name, and I shared it with her. She claimed to know him and started saying positive things about him, describing him differently from how I knew him, which was strange because I looked more like my mother. At this point, I became uneasy and tried to pull my hand away, but she wouldn't let go. She kept insisting on taking me to her home and feeding me some sweets. That's when it struck me that she couldn't possibly take me to her home, given her earlier story. I got frightened and told her that I needed to get back home because my parents would scold me if I was late. I started using more force to free my wrist from her grip. She resisted and even tried to drag me towards a dark lane by the road, saying that I had to accept her return gift. Finally, I managed to pull my hand away with all my strength and ran straight home. As I reached my house, I was breaking out in a cold sweat. My parents were understandably angry and confused when I explained this whole entire crazy situation. This happened to me a few years ago, probably back in 2017 when I was 14. I still think about this encounter almost every day. My dad lives near a small lake in Wisconsin. There are only about 100 people who live in the neighborhood. My brother and I spent every other week up there, so we knew pretty much everyone. My dad's house was the second house to the top of this large hill. At the very top is a gas station and the diner where I would work over the summer. At the bottom of the hill was the lake and a small beach. That morning, I was waitressing at the diner, and at the end of my shift, I bought a slushie from the gas station and was planning on going down to the beach for the afternoon. Parked outside the diner was a gorgeous teal vintage car. I'm not sure what brand. I'm not good with that kind of stuff, but it seemed to be from the 60s, and it caught my eye. There was an older man in the driver's seat, and his wife was in the passenger seat. They had their windows up, and I wasn't too close, so I didn't get a great look at them, but I did notice that they were looking at me. I didn't think anything of it and started walking home. On my walk home, I remember wondering where they could be from. We don't get many tourists, and I would have remembered if someone drove a car like that. The diner was off of a pretty quiet highway, and it was rarely used by out-of-towners, but I assumed that they were just driving through. My younger brother and I went to the beach that afternoon and hung out for a few hours. When we decided to head home, I packed up my stuff probably a minute before he did and started walking home before him. On the walk up the hill, there was probably half a city's blocks distance between us, and he could clearly see me, but we were too far to talk. I heard a car coming towards me and looked back and moved to the side of the street. It's the car that I saw earlier at the diner. They slow down as they approach me, and I kind of start to get nervous. The woman in the passenger seat rolls down her window, and I nearly crap my pants. They both seemed to be wearing hyper-realistic latex face masks. There seemed to be no beginning and end to the mask, and there weren't noticeable holes for eyes, yet their eyes definitely seemed real, and there was no seam at the edge of the neck. If they were wearing masks, they were some of the best masks that I'd ever seen, and must have cost a fortune, but it definitely wasn't their skin. There's no way. Something about them was just so off. The woman asked me for directions to a highway I've never heard of. I didn't drive yet, so this in and of itself wasn't weird, but I pointed them to the highway by the diner that leads out of town. They thanked me, rolled up the window, and drove away. I ran to my brother and told him what happened, and he said they looked pretty normal when they drove past him, but they looked normal to me that morning as well. The masks were too good. You had to be close enough to notice how strange they looked. There was just something so unsettling about them. They didn't really do anything odd except asking a girl, who was clearly too young to drive, for directions, but it was a very small community. I might have been the first person they had seen in hours, and it was just the way they looked. I'd never seen anything like it, and I haven't seen anything like it since. I mentioned it to my dad when I got home, but he didn't have much to say about it. I still feel deeply unnerved when I think about it more than 6 years later. I don't believe much in the paranormal stuff, and I do think that they were human, but why the masks? What were they doing there? And why ask a child who was obviously too young to drive for directions to a highway? Has anyone ever experienced something as strange as this before? I work overnights at a 24-hour diner. You can probably guess what company. I'm used to weird people and odd things happening, but tonight was just too much. The restaurant backs up to a field that has a tree line, and my cook and I went out back to smoke. We could hear someone yelling in the distance, but we get a lot of homeless people that come through town that usually are harmless, so we just shrugged it off as weird and went back inside. Later I came out again to smoke and throw away some trash in the dumpster that's next to the field. It was stupid to go over to it, but I hadn't heard him again. As I'm walking away from the dumpster, I hear, "Hey, come here. Hey, come here." It was much closer than when we heard him yelling the first time. I went inside and got my coworker, who owns a car with a spotlight on it. We shined it into the field, which, again, I'm not smart, and we admit that, but we couldn't see where he was, but he kept saying, "Hey girl, come here." I called the cops by this point, because it was just too weird. As soon as I get off the phone with him, he comes walking out of the field. He's an older man wearing a tan trench coat, and my coworker and customer ran back inside, because this dude was hauling it across the parking lot. He started to come towards the door, and I called the cops again. My cook cut him off and told him he needed to go. The man was acting erratically, yelling at my cook, and said, "I'll end your life next time I see ya." He kept moving his jacket by his waist like he was flashing a weapon, but I couldn't see anything from inside. Cops get him down the road, and an officer came by and basically said the guy's homeless and not mentally stable. No kidding. We told him everything that happened, and my cook pressed charges on him. The officer told us that there wasn't anything they could do, and he wouldn't give her his name, so they let him go. It basically ended with, "Oh, by the way, he's known to carry a knife in his waistband. Call us if you need us. Bye." He came back, again hauling it across the neighboring parking lot and back into the field, and we could hear him screaming, yelling, "Hey, come here," again and again. We got busy when the bars closed, and haven't heard him yelling since, but I know he's still back there, because I caught him sleeping behind the dumpster before. My manager comes in the morning, and I'm going to try and get her to let me take a picture of him off the security tape so I can warn the other third shift workers. The field that he's camping out in also backs to a middle school, but the cops said again there was nothing they could do. Hopefully he moves on and leaves us alone, or the cops can get him on something where no one gets hurt. In 2018, I lived with my partner and my German Shepherd in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago. I was 33 years old, and our neighbor was a fourth-floor walk-up unit. Very typical low-budget Chicago rental in a changing neighborhood. The layout of our building is going to matter to the story. Our building had a total of 12 units. Mine and the 3 below me had a shared front entrance, and the other 8 units were through a second entrance. All 12 apartments had connected back porches and stairs that shared a walkway to a rear gate which led to an alley. From the front stairwell, there are windows on each landing to the back porches, so you can see the back door of my apartment when standing at the front door through that window. We had good relations with our neighbors, especially those that lived directly below us and shared our front door. This was the thing that saved all 3 of us: my partner, my dog, and myself. My partner was in a touring band at the time and would leave for weekends for weeks at a time, and it was a scary thing for me because I was actually hurt and stalked by my ex in my teens and 20s. I always worried something would tip him off and he'd start stalking me again. A little less than a month before a 2-week tour my partner had scheduled, I received a creepy Facebook message from that stalker ex from yet another new account. About a week after that, my car was broken into. The glove box was empty and things were thrown around, but the only thing that was taken was a bag of dog treats. I had about $20 and change in the compartment between the seats, and they left the money. I was on high alert at that point and very scared about the time that I'd be alone during the tour. My partner was kind of irritated with me in the situation and felt that it was too last minute to cancel, especially over what amounted to be a bad feeling and a few isolated things that weren't direct threats. And truthfully, car break-ins are very common in Chicago. It happened to me like 15 times, and police usually do reports over the phone and don't even come to the scene. What I found really strange was that the thief didn't take the money. There was a homeless man who had started camping on the boulevard nearby recently. My partner left for his tour, and I set up cameras and bought door braces for my front and back doors. I became completely nocturnal, unable to sleep at night. My poor dog developed diarrhea, maybe because she was picking up on my stress level. It meant that I was taking her down all 4 flights of stairs for her to go blast her bowel 6 or 7 times a night. I had the distinct prickly crawling sensation of being watched when I would take her out, but I couldn't tell what was genuine and what was my own fear and paranoia. Her diarrhea lasted an unusually long time, like 3 or 4 days. I was going in and out of the main door a lot, feeling very scared, and I noticed that some of my neighbors wouldn't pull the door all the way closed so the lock engaged. I mentioned it to my downstairs neighbor one day, including that I was extra careful because of the stalker. He was supportive, said that he'd mention it to the other neighbors if he saw them, and I noticed that the door was locked more frequently after that. My partner came home at about 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. At about 8:30 a.m. that morning, my first floor neighbor's place was burglarized. He was a metalhead dude who collected instruments and sold weed and psychedelics and lived alone. I guess he went out for breakfast and left his door unlocked while he was gone. Someone had come in, eaten the leftovers in his fridge, took a coat and a pair of boots and left a filthy coat and a pair of boots and took his college diploma, but left $500 in the same cabinet. They'd left all the expensive musical instruments and mixing equipment, left the drugs, but did take a set of keys. The keys were to the first floor apartment and a master key for the front door and the back gate. My neighbors ran into each other right after the break-in, and the second floor neighbor said to go tell me because I had a stalker. So my metalhead neighbor came up to let me know what had happened. My partner had just gotten home from his tour when he knocked at the front door. I jumped out of my skin but looked through the peephole, recognized him, and the 3 of us stood on the stairs at the front door while he told us about the break-in. We jabber-jawed for a while, about 15 to 20 minutes, and while we were talking we heard the front door open and close below us, but really didn't think anything of it. Then we saw a man climbing up my back porch steps at the back door through the window. There was no other apartment that he could have been going to, and he had to walk past all 11 more accessible units on his way to mine. He was not my stalker, and I didn't recognize him, but his image is burned into my mind. He was wearing flashy black and white high-top sneakers, not the ones stolen from downstairs. His black coat was oversized and hanging off of his shoulders. We locked eyes through the window, and he froze halfway up the stairs to my back porch. He slowly took a cell phone and called someone as he slowly turned around halfway up the steps. He walked back down the stairs in artificial slow motion, as if he were pretending to be nonchalant, and then bolted into a sprint as soon as he hit the porch below mine. My neighbor ran downstairs and dialed 911. My partner and I ran through the apartment to the back porch and saw a sedan and a windowless van pulling out from the sketchy building 2 doors down. Both cars floored it out of the alley. We didn't get the license plate numbers, but the cops said that it wouldn't have mattered. There wasn't any crime committed and nothing concrete to justify stopping them. They very condescendingly explained this to me as they took my statement later. My neighbor is the one who actually made the call and has the police report, and my partner and I were just considered witnesses. For a long time, the thing that scared me the most was the tool that my neighbor found when he went running downstairs. It was a 2x4 piece of wood cut to about 2 feet, but about 6 inches of it had been made into a handle. It looked like a paddle, and for a long time I couldn't figure out what it was, but I'm pretty sure that it was a ram for the door jamb and locks. When I looked at my door afterward, it looked like the frame had been repaired, like it had been broken open before. It seems like they used the one master key to place their ram and get somebody at the back door to catch me if I tried to run out that way, and somebody else was going to come back around since they only had one key, and they'd break in my front door and go forward with whatever they had planned. When we caught them, before they could catch me unaware, they seemed to have aborted the plan. I suspect that they had been watching me, especially while I was taking out my dog, and figured that I was alone. It was pure coincidence that my partner had gotten home 30 minutes before all of this. I feel that we all could have been horribly injured, or worse, had we been trapped inside, and they had gotten the jump on us. Nothing else ever came of it except that my landlord refused to change the locks, but he did agree to let us out of our lease. I moved out of Chicago, and now I've added a younger dog I'm training to do some bite work. My house is surrounded by cameras and floodlights, and I have wing-net neighbors. This happened pretty recently. I, a 23-year-old female, work in property management. I was not supposed to be working alone that day, but my manager and coworker called in sick, and my other coworker had requested time off that we all forgot about. I voiced my concerns because the property is in a crime-ridden area, and I've had some bad experiences in the past. I actually transitioned to a different role because I no longer felt safe, but they offered me a lot of money to come back, so I did. The front door stayed locked during business hours, so literally anybody could walk in. Also, it's a large and busy property. I needed someone with me just to help with all the tours and residents. Nobody was able to do anything, so I called one of our sister properties and begged for their leaser to help me. They agreed, but the leaser was going to have to leave early. I agreed, and was just happy to have someone help. Flash forward to an hour before closing, and the leaser had to go. Literally, as she walked out, this disgruntled man walked in holding a duffel bag. I hate to profile him, but he was clearly homeless and not all there mentally. He walked up to me and handed me his ID. I asked him how I can help him, and all he could say was, "You don't respect veterans." I again asked how I could help him, and he couldn't give me a straight answer. I was getting fed up when the coworker who had requested the day off happened to come in just to say hi. My coworker instantly knew something was off, so he came over to investigate. The homeless guy didn't like my coworker asking him all these questions, so he opened up his duffel bag and started sorting through it. He pulled out a piece of women's lingerie and threw it on my desk. Then he pulled out a box, and in that box was an SD card. He was trying to put it at my computer, and I told him to not do that. He listened to me, but proceeded to rummage through his bag. He seemed very irritated, because we kept telling him, "If he can't help us, how can we help you then? You're going to need to leave." At this point, I'm getting scared that he's going to pull out a gun and just light us up. Instead of a gun, he pulls out a knife. Instantly, both me and my coworker started to scream at him to put the knife away and to leave. He eventually put the knife away, but refused to leave. I messaged my manager, who was out sick but lived on site, to please call the cops, and told him that there was a guy with a knife in the office. My coworker, who was with me, didn't physically force him out, but he guided him out by walking towards him and making himself look threatening. Finally, the dude leaves, and we immediately locked the doors. He kept trying to come back in, and was cussing up a storm outside. Eventually, he made his way to the convenience store that is attached to the building. Within 30 seconds of him going in, about 4 squad cars pull up. We pointed at the store, and they ran in there. The guy got aggressive with the police, so they beat him and ended up detaining him. I told the police to look in his bag for the knife, and they found it. I identified the weapon and answered some of the police's questions. I didn't press charges because this was clearly a mental health crisis and jail isn't going to reform that. He needs serious professional help. The DA pressed charges on my behalf and the courts granted me a protection order. They also let him go without bail. The last update I got was that he didn't show up to his court hearing and now there's a warrant out for his arrest. I wonder why. I've not seen him since that event took place, and that's all I really care about. It's been about 10 years since this happened, but I still remember things pretty clearly. I should note that this is told from my perspective, and I wish I could get my mother's perspective on it as well. She just doesn't remember the events as well as I do. And for context, I lived in a mid-sized city in the southern United States, where the main thing to do at the time was to go to the mall. Sure, we had movie theaters and a couple of bowling alleys, but besides that there really wasn't much to the city. My mom worked at a department store located in the mall, and having nothing better to do I would regularly go and sit in the break room while she worked. It gave me a reason to get out of the house, and if I wanted to I was allowed to walk around the mall or get something to snack on in the food court. Honestly though, I was shy and preferred to just stay cooped up in the break room playing video games on my Nintendo DS. My mom's coworkers were generally very sweet to me and frequently popped in to say hello or just check on me during downtime. If I was lucky enough to go with my mom on weekends, I could usually convince my mom to pick up my friend. We were actually dating, but since we were both girls, I didn't want that to get out to go along with us. Going to the mall meant that I was free from doing chores at home, but it was a cheap way to sneak a secret date in every now and then. My girlfriend, though, never really liked staying in the break room with me. She always wanted to walk around the mall. I should note that she really enjoyed taking walks, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to want to do so at the mall as well. I just didn't like walking as much as she did, so I tried to weasel my way out of it whenever I could. I could usually convince her to walk over to a nearby store and look around or go grab something from the food court rather than walking, but I noticed pretty quickly that she wasn't trying to actually get me to walk around. She just didn't want me to be in the break room. And now my girlfriend was more perceptive to things than I was, and I assumed that she just didn't like the ambiance of the break room for some reason. And for a little while I let it go. But eventually I got frustrated and asked directly what was really bothering her about the break room. I thought she was going to tell me that it was too cramped or the lights randomly cutting off made her uneasy or something. The things that bothered me about it too. But no, what she told me was that she heard things in the ceiling, like someone was walking around in there. I had learned from my mother that there was a room in the ceiling, but it wasn't for walking around. It was for maintenance. Most of the stuff in there was wiring and insulation. But technically someone could get up there. So I told my girlfriend this, and said it was likely an employee up there fixing something. She said that was fine, but she didn't really like it, and still preferred to just walk around or sitting in the food court. I understood her discomfort, and wanted to help, so I agreed. We had a really good relationship, and the sense of communication. Though I got frustrated, I wanted to make sure that she felt comfortable. Later that day I mentioned what my girlfriend had told me, and asked what they were fixing in the ceiling. Though my mom looked distressed and said that they hadn't been up there fixing anything that day. But she wanted me to see something. My mom took me into the receiving room of the department store, which was just a room off in the back filled with boxes and random junk the store was going to put out for sale. The layout of this room, though, was sort of an L shape. One part of the L was used for receiving, but the other part was the way into the ceiling. I should clarify for this next part that to get into the ceiling the store would have to call for the mall's maintenance team. They didn't have a ladder or anything on hand to climb in there, as it would have been a safety hazard. The only thing that this particular area had was a hatch that led into the ceiling, and that was it. So needless to say, I was horrified to see what appeared to be claw marks leading up the wall to the hatch. I still remember the way they looked. Brown gashes that had been dug into the concrete wall of the receiving room. I asked my mom if it was some sort of prank, but she told me that it wasn't the first time that it had happened, and she had no way of knowing I would even ask about it. According to her, these weird carvings had shown up several times over the course of a few months. Each time the store would call in the mall's security and maintenance teams, who would clean the wall up and then go into the ceiling to investigate. Nothing had ever come of their searches, though, and they eventually gave up dealing with the marks. The only explanation mall security could give was that it was likely a homeless individual who had made their way into the ceiling by sheer willpower, and happened to be very good at hiding during the searches. I stopped staying at the mall with my mom after that, and any time I wanted my girlfriend to come over we found somewhere else to go during the day. Sometimes she'd just come over to my house and watch TV or whatever, but I didn't feel safe going back to the break room after that. I knew nothing had happened up until that point, but I just didn't want to risk it honestly. So to whoever or whatever was walking around in the ceiling at my mom's workplace, I hope we never meet again. For context, I moved into my new house about a year or two ago. I had lived in the area for a year before, but we were evicted due to the owners of our old house wanting to move in. I'm a young female still living with my family, which makes the story even more strange and unsettling. When you look out my window, you see my fence, and then a house. They are up on a small hill, so the fence doesn't block anything. The first encounter I had with this man was late at night. I was with some friends while all of our parents were out at a party. I will say that my friends and I are old enough to be left at home, and we were responsible. We were just relaxing in my room with no light or music on. We had turned the TV off when we were alone. We heard my dog start barking for a good 10 minutes, and we passed this off because she barks at absolutely everything from birds on the power line to bugs on the front porch. Basically anything that moves. We started hearing weirder noises like crunching circling the perimeter of my room and scratching on the walls. I kid you not, the moment we started getting scared, the loudest bangs I'd ever heard began pounding on my glass sliding door. My 3 friends and I ran out of the room to see what in the world could be making this much noise. We were greeted by an aggressive dog which was up on the glass pounding on the door. My dog was scared. She usually doesn't do this, but she backed away behind me into the room with all of her fur up. Then we saw it. A man dressed in all black standing at the door. We were all standing perfectly still, but I guess my friend's flight response kicked in, and just as he had jumped to lock the door, the man reached for it too. My friend yelled, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" He responded with a simple, "I don't know," and walked off with his dog, which was on a leash. When our parents got back, we told them about him. They asked us why we didn't call them. Truthfully, I know we should have, but I didn't want to ruin my mom's birthday party. I have learned from this. 2 days later, my mom confronted our neighbor who was mowing the lawn. He said that it was in fact him, and that his dog had run into our gate, and he got the dog back. He said he meant to come and talk to her earlier about it, but didn't. I thought it was a normal story until I thought back to that night. The gate that his dog supposedly ran through has a tough clasp that was shut on that night. We have it there so our dog can't get out, and so nothing can come in, but you can open it by hand, meaning that this man opened the gate and let himself and his dog in. My theory is that he heard the music stop and didn't see lights from his house, so he decided that he was going to come and, I don't know, rob us. The noises we heard must have been him scaling the perimeter of my room for 10 minutes before attempting to enter. We filed a police report, and nothing happened for a few months until one night. I was in bed, almost asleep, but still getting comfortable. I set up to rearrange my pillows and turned around to make it more comfortable when I saw a face outside my window staring back at me. Whoever it was wearing a black face covering, and I texted my mom and froze. I heard movement, and then my mom came and checked, and nothing was there. This wasn't just my imagination, as my neighbor's lights are visible from the crack in my curtain, but the face was covering a majority of the light. Ever since then, I have noticed them watching, and whenever I catch them looking, they get up from their balcony and leave. I'll catch them watching in the same spot only 5 minutes later. A few years back, I, a 23-year-old female, was driving home after taking my dad to the airport for a late flight. It was already dark when I left the airport, and I still had a 3-hour drive home. A few hours into the drive, I get recalculated to some windy back road highway. There were no cars or street lights, so it was pretty dark and pretty creepy. As I turned to curve, I noticed a black car come out of nowhere and start to ride my bumper. Then the blue lights. The road was so dark that I had to drive for a minute to find a spot with at least a few lights where I could pull over. The officer came up to my window and asked me if I knew that my tags were expired. I thought it was kind of odd because I was driving my mom's car, and she's usually pretty on top of those things. But it was more so the way he talked that made me uneasy. He was speaking pretty fast, like he was in a hurry or something. As he's standing at my window, before he even gets my license and registration, his radio beeps and tells me that he has to go to another call. He practically runs back to the car and speeds off. I head back home, half weirded out, half thanking God that I didn't get a ticket. I kind of brush it off until I go outside to my car the next day and find that my tags were not due to expire for 2 more months. It could have been a simple mistake, but I couldn't help recalling how weird the whole incident was. He could have misread the number, but looking back I wonder what could have happened if he was someone with bad intentions. From then on, I pull over only in well-populated areas, and if a safe option is unavailable, call 911 to make them aware. I'll never forget the day I went to pick out a pumpkin for Halloween. It was supposed to be a simple, regular trip. You know, the kind where you grab a pumpkin, carve it up, and let it sit on the porch with a flickering candle inside. But things didn't go as planned. It was late October, a few days before Halloween. The air was chilly, the kind of cold that sneaks through your clothes and clings to your skin. But the thing I remember most was the fog. Thick, heavy fog that blanketed everything. Driving through it felt like moving through a dream. The trees lining the road were just dark shapes looming in the mist, and the headlights of my truck barely cut through the haze. I had to squint just to stay on the road. I was heading to Old Thompson's Pumpkin Patch, a farm just outside of town. A buddy of mine had recommended it and said they had the best pumpkins. Old Man Thompson runs it, he had said. Bit of an odd guy, but it's worth it for the pumpkins. I didn't care much about the old man. I just wanted a good pumpkin, something big enough to carve a decent jack-o'-lantern. The fog made the drive feel longer than it should have been, and by the time I pulled into the gravel lot in front of the farm, the sun was starting to set behind the fog, casting everything in a dull gray light. The place was eerily quiet. No other cars, no sounds except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I stepped out of my truck and looked around. The field stretched out in front of me, rows and rows of pumpkins barely visible through the fog. I could only see a few feet in any direction. Beyond that, everything faded into the mist like the world just ended at the edge of the farm. There was a small shack near the entrance, an old wooden structure that looked like it hadn't seen any repairs in years. A crooked sign hung from the roof, pumpkins for sale, and sitting next to it in a rickety chair was the old man. He didn't move as I approached, just sat there slouched, with his head low and his wide-brimmed hat hiding most of his face. His clothes were worn and tattered, his coat hanging loose on his thin frame. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his hands resting on his lap looked like gnarled branches. "Excuse me," I said, stopping a few feet away from him. My voice felt strange in the stillness, like it didn't quite belong there. "I'm here to get a pumpkin." He didn't respond at first, didn't even lift his head. I started to feel a little uneasy, standing there in the fog with this strange old man. I cleared my throat, trying again. "Do I just pick one from the field?" Slowly, the old man lifted his head. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He stared at me for a moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through me, but I told myself it was just the cold. "There in the back," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The back?" I repeated, glancing at the field. The pumpkins were right there, scattered across the ground, but the fog made it hard to see far. He nodded, then slowly stood up from the chair, using a walking stick for support. He pointed past the field toward the far end, where I could just make out the shape of an old beat-up truck parked in the mist. The fog swirled around it, making it seem like it was floating on the edge of the world. I didn't want to follow him, but something about his stare made me feel like I didn't have much of a choice. I nodded and followed as he began to shuffle toward the truck. His footsteps were slow, dragging through the gravel as the fog thickened around us. The further we walked, the more distant everything felt. The road, the shack, everything seemed to disappear behind us, swallowed by the fog. When we reached the truck, the old man stopped and gestured toward the back. It was an old, rusted thing, the kind you'd expect to see abandoned in a junkyard. The bed of the truck was filled with pumpkins, but they weren't like the ones in the field. These pumpkins were darker, almost black, their shapes warped and twisted like they had grown long. I frowned. I didn't like the look of them, but I figured it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes. "Which one can I take?" I asked, glancing at the old man. He didn't answer. He had moved behind the truck, out of sight. I waited, expecting him to come back around and help me pick one out. But he didn't. The seconds ticked by, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. I called out, "Hey sir," but there was no reply. I took a step closer, peering around the side of the truck. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. Nothing. I felt a strange twinge of panic rising in my chest. He couldn't have just disappeared. There was nowhere to go. The fog was too thick, and the field was wide open. I walked to the back of the truck, expecting to find him crouched down or something, but he wasn't there. He was gone. The spot where he had been standing was empty, just fog swirling in the air. I looked around, my heart racing now. There was no way he could have walked off without me hearing him. I should have been able to see him through the fog, at least a shadow or a shape moving away. But there was nothing. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The air felt colder, the fog pressing in around me, thicker than before. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't want one of those pumpkins. I didn't even want to know what had just happened. I turned and hurried back toward my truck, my boots crunching on the gravel faster now. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. All I could think about was getting out of there, getting away from that fog, that field, and that strange vanishing old man. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. As I pulled onto the main road, the fog seemed to lift a little, but the uneasy feeling in my chest stayed with me. I never went back to that farm. Every time I pass it, even from a distance, I feel that same chill creep up my spine. I don't know what I saw that day, or where the old man went, but something wasn't right about that place. I want to tell you a story that still haunts me, even though it happened almost a year ago. It's the kind of thing you never expect to happen to you, especially when you're just trying to take a break from life for a while. My girlfriend Katie and I rented a cabin from Airbnb last October, thinking we'd enjoy a quiet, peaceful weekend in the woods. But what we found there was something we could have never prepared for. It was late afternoon when we arrived. The drive had been long, winding through forests that were just beginning to show the vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows of autumn. The cabin was exactly what we had hoped for, small, cozy, and isolated. It was tucked away off a gravel road, far from any nearby houses or towns. The air smelled of pine and damp leaves, the kind of scent that makes you feel like you're truly away from the chaos of everyday life. When we pulled up, everything seemed normal. The cabin looked clean and well kept, with a wraparound porch and a small pile of firewood stacked neatly by the door. We unloaded our bags, feeling excited about the weekend ahead. The inside was rustic, with a wood-burning stove, cozy couches, and a few old books left on a shelf by previous renters. It seemed perfect. Too perfect, maybe. After settling in, we decided to explore the cabin. Katie wanted to start by lighting a fire, so I began poking around, looking for matches and maybe a hatchet to chop some kindling. That's when I noticed a small door tucked away behind the kitchen. It was low, almost hidden, and I wouldn't have even seen it if I hadn't been looking for tools. "Hey, what do you think's down here?" I called Katie. She came over and looked at the door, a curious expression on her face. "Maybe storage? I don't know, it's kind of weird. But I guess cabins have cellars, right?" I shrugged and tried the knob, but it was locked. That struck me as odd. Why would a basement or cellar be locked in a rental? Still, I didn't think too much of it at the time. Katie and I decided to forget about it and enjoy the evening instead. We spent the rest of the day relaxing. We cooked a simple dinner and played cards by the fire, and by the time night fell, we were both feeling pretty good about our decision to come out here. The peacefulness of the woods, the crackling fire, it was the perfect escape. But things took a turn later that night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, like maybe a branch tapping against the window, or an animal rustling around in the woods. But as I lay there listening, I realized it was coming from inside the house. And more than that, it was coming from beneath us. The knocking was coming from the basement. Katie was still fast asleep, but I could feel my heart start to race. The knocking continued, slow and steady, like someone was trapped down there trying to get out. I shook Katie awake, and when she heard the noise too, she was just as freaked out as I was. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have a good answer. The smart thing to do would have been to leave, to get in the car and drive as far away from the cabin as we could. But something stopped me, curiosity maybe. I had to know what, or who, was making that noise. I grabbed the flashlight we'd brought with us, and headed for the small door behind the kitchen. Katie followed close behind, her eyes wide with fear. When I reached the door, the knocking stopped, as if whoever or whatever was down there knew we were coming. I hesitated for a second before pulling out my multi-tool and working at the lock. It took a few tries, but eventually, I heard the click of the latch giving way. Slowly I opened the door, revealing a narrow set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up from the basement was damp and musty, like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I shone the flashlight down the stairs, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was a man. He looked gaunt and exhausted, with dirty clothes and wild eyes. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, staring up at me as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Please help me," he rasped, his voice weak and cracked from what must have been days, weeks of dehydration. I was too stunned to speak. Katie gasped, gripping my arm tightly. What are you doing down here?" I finally managed to ask, The man explained in broken sentences. He had rented the cabin a month ago, but he had gotten into some kind of dispute with the owner. He couldn't pay the full amount, and instead of dealing with it in a normal way, the owner had locked him in the basement. He had been stuck down there ever since, surviving on what little food and water had been left for him. I didn't know whether to believe him or not. The whole situation was so surreal, like something out of a horror movie, but looking at the man, at his desperate hollow eyes, I knew he wasn't lying. No one could fake that kind of terror. We called the police immediately. When they arrived, they took the man to safety and arrested the cabin owner. I didn't get to see him, but the police told us later that he was a normal-looking guy, someone who didn't fit the profile of a monster. But looks can be deceiving, and that man had kept another human being locked away in his basement for weeks. We never got all the details. The police handled the investigation, and Katie and I left the cabin the next morning. We didn't want to stay another night, not after what we'd found. To this day, I still think about that man. How close we came to just ignoring the knocking. How we might have left, and no one would have ever known he was down there. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Back when I was in middle school, I joined the school basketball team. I wasn't any good at basketball, but I signed up to keep busy after school. I wanted something to fill my time, even though I knew deep down that basketball wasn't for me. The other kids knew it too. They teased me all the time about how I could never make a basket, but I stuck with it, hoping things would get better, though they never did. One afternoon, after a long 2-hour practice, we all headed to the locker room to change. School ended at 3:30, and we practiced until 6. It was a routine by now, a tiring one. I hadn't brought my phone that day, which made me nervous. I knew my mom was picking me up later, and I hoped she'd brought my phone with her. Not having it felt strange, like I was cut off from the world, but I wasn't thinking too much about it at the time. I was changing out of my sweaty clothes when I noticed 3 guys from the team walking toward. They were the usual ones who teased me during practice, always ready with some comment about my poor performance. As they approached, I braced myself. Sure enough, they started mocking me, saying I was the worst player on the team and that I couldn't make a basket to save my life. I tried to shrug it off, giving a fake laugh and saying whatever. But they weren't done. One of them said something under his breath, and before I knew it, they grabbed me. At first I thought they were just messing around, but then it hit me. They were going to put me in my locker. I had seen them do things like this before to other kids, but I never imagined they'd go this far with me. I asked them what they were doing, trying to keep my voice steady, but they didn't answer. They just told me to shut up and dragged me toward the lockers. I fought back, trying to wriggle free, but they were stronger. Before I knew it, they shoved me into my locker, slamming the door shut. I thought that would be it, that they'd leave it unlocked, and I could push it open once they got bored. But I was wrong. I heard the clink of the lock being put in place. They had locked me in. I panicked. I pounded on the door, shouting for them to let me out, but they just laughed and walked away, their footsteps echoing as they left the locker room. Silence followed. I was trapped, locked in a small dark space with no way out. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was completely alone. Minutes passed, then an hour. I kept yelling, hoping someone would hear me, but no one came. I tried not to think about the fact that I had no phone. If I had brought it, I could have called for help. Instead, I was stuck in this tiny space, my only hope being that someone would eventually find me. The air in the locker felt heavy. I sat down, curling up in the cramped space, my knees pressed against my chest. Time seemed to slow down, and the silence around me became deafening. I was starting to lose hope when, finally, I heard something, the faint sound of a door creaking open. I perked up, banging on the locker door again, yelling for help. Footsteps approached, and then a voice called out, asking what I was doing in there. Relief washed over me. Someone had finally come. Through the tiny slits in the locker door, I saw a man in a janitor's uniform. He wasn't pleased. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head at the situation. I told him what had happened, that some guys had locked me in here after practice. He seemed annoyed but not surprised. The janitor said he didn't have the key to the lock, so he'd have to grab some tool to cut it off. He left for what felt like an eternity, though it was only a few minutes. The locker room felt colder now, as if the air had seeped out with him. But then he came back, holding a small angle grinder. After some loud scraping sounds, the lock finally came off, and the door swung open. I stumbled out, my legs stiff from sitting cramped up for so long. I thanked the janitor, my voice shaky. He didn't say much, just told me to be careful next time, and walked off, probably tired of dealing with students like me. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. I ran down the hall to the school lobby, my heart still racing. When I got there, I saw my mom pacing back and forth, worry written all over her face. She rushed over when she saw me, asking where I had been. I told her everything about the boys in the locker. She was angry and relieved at the same time, hugging me tightly as I told her the story. That night we talked for a long time. We decided that I would quit the basketball team. There was no point in staying, not when things had gone this far. I didn't want to be around those bullies anymore. It wasn't worth it. I didn't care about basketball that much, and I knew there were better things I could do with my time. The next day I found out the 3 boys who had locked me and had been suspended for 2 weeks. It felt strange knowing they were being punished. I had expected more, maybe even expulsion, but at least they were gone for a while. I didn't have to see their faces again, and that was enough for me. In the end I found other after-school clubs to join. I made real friends, ones who didn't mock me or push me into lockers. I never played basketball again after that. It just wasn't worth it. Now, whenever I see a basketball game on TV, I think back to that day, to the sound of the lock clicking into place, and I'm reminded that sometimes walking away is the best decision you can make. My husband works nights at the local diner. He leaves before the sun sets, and I don't see him until the next morning when he's tired and quiet. It's a lonely routine, especially out here in the countryside, where the nearest neighbor is a long walk away. But we've been managing. It's peaceful most nights, just me, the trees, and the wind outside. Last night was different. It was around 2 a.m., and I was already in bed, trying to fall asleep. The sound of the old house creaking was normal, so I wasn't bothered by that. But then there was a knock. It came from downstairs, near the front door. It was soft at first, like someone tapping gently. My first thought was that maybe my husband came back early. It was rare, but sometimes he would get off early if the diner was slow. The knock wasn't urgent, just enough to catch my attention. I threw the blanket off, feeling the cool air hit my skin as I got out of bed. The house felt colder than usual, but I didn't think much of it. I hurried down the stairs, my feet moving quicker with the thought of seeing him home early. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a second. The knock had stopped, and everything was quiet. I opened the door, just enough to peek out. But there was nothing. No one. Just the front yard, bathed in pale moonlight, the trees in the distance swaying gently in the night breeze. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting, listening. I thought maybe he had gone around the back door, but I didn't hear any footsteps. The stillness was unsettling. Finally, I closed the door, locking it. I turned off the light in the hall, making my way back to bed. Just as I was about to settle back under the covers, it happened again. Another knock, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. My heart started beating faster. I got up again, this time moving slower. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked toward the door. When I opened it, a child was standing on the porch. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. He was small, with messy hair and wide, confused eyes. He looked up at me like he was lost. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice soft but strange, almost like he wasn't fully awake. I was taken aback. Where did this kid come from? There weren't any children nearby, not for miles. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, maybe his parents. But there was no one, just him standing there alone. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't leave a child out there in the middle of the night. I knelt, trying to get more information. Before I could ask, something shifted in the shadows behind him. A man stepped out from the darkness. I didn't see him at first, because he blended in so well with the night. He was tall, his face partially hidden, but I saw the glint of something in his hand. A knife. The realization hit me like a wave. He wasn't there to help the child. He was using him as bait. The man took a step forward, and I slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as my hands would let me. I pressed my back against the door, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to catch my breath. I heard the man outside pacing, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Then, the knocking started again. Not at the door this time. At the window. I turned my head toward the sound, the soft tap of metal against glass. He was trying to get in, testing the windows, moving from one to the next, each knock sending a spike of fear through me. I didn't know what he was capable of, or how far he would go. My phone was upstairs, and every second I spent frozen in place felt like a lifetime. The sound of the knocking was relentless, moving around the house, first one window, then another. It felt like a game to him. I forced myself to move, sprinting up the stairs, my legs shaky as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. My voice trembled as I told them what was happening. They said they'd send someone right away, but out here in the countryside, I knew it would take time. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. I stayed upstairs, listening, praying that the windows would hold. I didn't know if the man was alone or if more people were waiting outside. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pull up in front of the house. The knocking stopped. Everything went silent again. When I looked out the window, the man was gone. There was no sign of the child, no one lurking in the yard. The police searched the area, shining their flashlights into the trees, but they didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably just someone passing through, maybe trying to scare me. But I knew it was more than that. The way the man moved, the way he used the child, it felt planned, deliberate. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the sun to rise, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if I had hesitated for just a second longer. Back in the mid-1970s, when I was about 12 years old, my friends and I spent almost every weekend at a playground in Flushing, Queens. It was a typical hangout spot for us, not because of the swings or slides, but for the basketball court and pickleball games. My group of friends, Sean, Jay, Jabbar, Apu, and Tino, were all a bit too old for the playground equipment, but we loved the space to run around. Most days were the same, routine and predictable, but one Saturday stands out more vividly than the rest. That day, Sean and I weren't in the mood for pickleball. The others were already deep into their game, but I had a different idea in mind. I was always the troublemaker, dragging Sean into things he normally wouldn't do. As we wandered away from the pickleball court, I looked toward the highway nearby. It was close enough that we could see the cars whizzing by, the blur of colors flashing in front of us like a challenge. I turned to Sean with a mischievous grin and asked, "You want to throw rocks at cars on the freeway?" His eyes lit up, matching my excitement. He didn't even hesitate, chuckling and agreeing. Without a second thought, we started searching for rocks, picking out smooth, round ones that fit perfectly in our hands. We lined up along the sidewalk, the cars speeding past just below us. It felt thrilling, like we were breaking some invisible rule just by standing there. The first few rocks sailed harmlessly into the air, missing the cars completely. We were almost ready to give up, laughing at how bad our aim was, but then with one final throw, a rock hit a black Subaru with a sharp the sound startled us, cutting through the noise of the highway like a knife. For a split second, everything froze. Then panic set in. We took off running, our feet pounding against the pavement as fast as we could go. Sean was quicker than me, he always had been. I was heavier, struggling to keep up, but fear kept me moving. My mind raced faster than my legs. What if the driver saw us? What if he followed? The thought of being caught was unbearable. We ran back toward the playground, where our friends were still playing pickleball, completely unaware of the trouble we had just stirred up. I was out of breath by the time we reached them, gasping for air as I stumbled onto the court. Sean was already there, looking a lot calmer than I felt. Trying to hide my fear, I shouted to our friends, telling them to switch places with us in the game. Without thinking, Jay and Apu stepped off the court, letting Sean and me take over. We had barely started playing when something made us stop. A man appeared, walking toward us with a purpose. In his hand, he carried a crowbar. My heart sank. This was the driver of the Subaru, no doubt about it. He wasn't shouting, but the look on his face said everything. His eyes swept over us, and I knew he was looking for the ones responsible. He asked where the kids who threw the rocks went, his voice filled with anger. My friends had no idea what he was talking about, and Jabbar asked him what he meant. I could feel Sean beside me, tense and quiet. I stayed calm, playing along with the act. When the man repeated that someone had hit his car with a rock, I pointed to my left, away from where we had come. "They went that way," I said, keeping my voice steady. The man nodded, muttering something as he jogged off in the direction I pointed. As soon as he was out of sight, the weight of what we had done hit me. Jay turned to me and Sean, suspicion in his eyes. He asked what had happened, and I confessed, telling him we had thrown rocks just for fun, not thinking about the consequences. Jay shook his head, disappointed but not surprised. He knew me well enough to expect this kind of behavior. "Whatever," he muttered, clearly unimpressed. "Let's just keep playing." The others followed his lead, and we went back to our game, trying to forget the tension that had just filled the air. For the rest of the day, we didn't see the man again. But something had changed. The adrenaline that had fueled my reckless behavior was gone, replaced by a heavy feeling of guilt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to return, even though I knew he wouldn't. Every time a car passed by the park, my stomach twisted, thinking it might be him coming back for revenge. But the hours dragged on, and eventually we all went home, the incident fading into the background like a bad dream. Now, decades later, I look back on that day with a mix of embarrassment and relief. Embarrassment for how reckless and stupid I had been, and relief that nothing worse had happened. That man with the crowbar could have easily caught us if things had gone differently. Who knows what he would have done? I often think about how lucky we were that day. I'm in my 50s now, with a wife and kids of my own. My children have never caused the kind of trouble I did back then. I've made sure of that. I taught them to respect other people and think before they act, something I wish I had understood when I was their age. It's strange how moments like that stick with you. A split-second decision to throw a rock at a car could have changed everything. It's a reminder, even all these years later, that one small action can spiral into something much bigger, something dangerous. And sometimes, you don't get as lucky as we did. A few years ago, when I was a sophomore at Hofstra University in Long Island, New York, I had just finished my degree in sports media, and my time at the school had been great overall. There were ups and downs like there are for everyone, but one night was far worse than anything I had ever expected. It was Halloween, my favorite time of the year. The day felt cool and crisp, with leaves swirling around campus. That night I had no plans. It was a Sunday, so most people were either at home or just hanging out. I thought maybe I'd find something to do, though, and as I left my dorm to get brunch, I noticed a poster pinned to the bulletin board in the hallway. It was for a frat party at Alpha Epsilon Pi, which I hadn't heard of before. This struck me as odd, since I was familiar with most of the fraternities on campus. The thought crossed my mind that something about it didn't seem quite right. Still, I figured I wasn't doing anything that night, so why not? It'd be a good way to pass the time. When nighttime came, I got dressed in a quick costume and made my way over to the frat house. The streets were dark and nearly empty as I walked, a slight wind rattling the trees. When I reached the house, it was quiet on the outside, but looked lively from within. I opened the front door, letting the sounds of loud music and laughter wash over me. Inside, a guy introduced himself to me as Alex Swozy. He was wearing a shirt with the fraternity's name on it, so I figured he was part of it. I'd heard rumors about him around campus, though. People said he was a creep, someone who should be avoided. I nodded at him and kept moving, hoping he wouldn't follow. He started talking to me, but I ignored most of what he said, pretending to be interested in other things. There was something off about him, though. He seemed to watch me closely, almost too closely. People had mentioned before that Alex was a cousin of Thomas Swozy, the U.S. representative for New York's 3rd Congressional District. I didn't care much for that detail, but I guess it explained why he seemed so full of himself. Eventually, I found the drinks and poured myself one. I wasn't planning on staying too long, but after about 15 minutes, I felt strange. The room seemed to spin, and I felt way more drunk than I should have. I'd had drinks before, but nothing had hit me like this. It felt wrong. I knew I had to leave, so I stumbled out of the party, weaving through the house and finally making it back to my dorm room. Once there, I managed to kick off my shoes and crawl under the covers, the spinning in my head growing worse. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. That drink, it had been spiked. As I lay in bed, everything felt surreal, and I couldn't shake the thought that I had made a mistake by going to that party. I shouldn't have trusted a frat I'd never heard of. But at that moment, all I could do was close my eyes and try to sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but at some point, I woke up to the sound of drawers being opened and closed. My room was dark, and my head felt heavy. At first, I thought I was dreaming, or maybe just confused from being so drunk, but the noise was real. I could hear my belongings being moved around. Slowly, I turned my head, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing by my bed. It was Alex. He was in my dorm room, standing right next to me, rummaging through my things. My mind struggled to process it. Why was he there? How did he get in? My door had been unlocked, of course. I had been too out of it to remember to lock it. He must have followed me back from the party. I could barely form a clear thought, still feeling the effects of whatever had been in that drink. But I knew I had to act. I forced myself out of bed, unsteady on my feet, and tried to push him out. My hands shoved at him, but my strength was weak. He just stood there staring at me like he didn't care at all about being caught. Somehow, I managed to force him toward the door. My body was sluggish, but I didn't stop pushing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I finally got him out of the room. I shut the door, locked it this time, and collapsed back into bed. The room was spinning again, and my limbs felt like lead, but at least he was gone. I had no idea what he had been planning to do, and I didn't want to think about it. The next morning I woke up feeling terrible. Not just from whatever had been in that drink, but from the fear that had gripped me the night before. I emailed my professors, telling them I wasn't well enough to come to class. There was no way I could function properly after what had happened. I realized how stupid I had been to go to a party for a fraternity I had never heard of. The whole situation had felt strange from the start, and I should have trusted my gut. Even worse, I hadn't reported Alex or the frat to anyone. Part of me knew it wouldn't have made a difference. Fraternities had their power, especially with Alex being connected to someone in politics. Nothing would have changed. That night haunted me for a long time. After that, I never went to another college party. Now on Halloween, I just stay home and hand out candy to trick-or-treaters. It's safer that way. At least in my own space, I don't have to worry about someone following me back to my room. It was the mid-2000s, back when I was a junior in high school. I remember that year vividly because my school's hockey team won the state championship. I was part of the team, and we were thrilled with our victory. Our captain Dexter was on top of the world that night. Dexter was one of the wealthiest kids in our school, and his family had a massive house. So to celebrate, he threw a huge party right after the game. Pretty much the entire school showed up. It was the kind of party you'd imagine in a movie. Loud music, tons of people, and a never-ending supply of drinks. I don't even remember how many beers I drank that night. I know that as the night went on, I was getting more and more wasted. The party was a blur of laughter, music, and people shouting over each other. It started around 9 p.m., and by the time it ended, it was already 2 in the morning. Time slipped away so quickly. When the party finally died down, I decided to head home with 3 of my closest friends on the hockey team. Thomas, William, and Jack. We piled into William's car with him behind the wheel. Jack took the passenger seat while Thomas and I sat in the back. I was sitting right behind Jack, and Thomas was behind William. None of us should have been driving that night, but we didn't think much of it. We were young, drunk, and reckless. The car felt unsteady almost from the start. William was swerving left and right, and I could feel the car lurching around as if he wasn't really in control. We were only about 5 minutes into the drive when things started to get worse. I remember looking out of the window, trying to focus, when suddenly the car seemed to lift off the ground. It felt like we were flying, but it wasn't some fun, weightless sensation. My heart dropped, and I realized what was happening. We were driving off a cliff. The panic hit me like a wave. All of us were screaming, but the sound was swallowed up by the car's tumble. The impact came hard and fast. The car smashed into the ground, and everything went dark for a split second. The first thing I noticed when I came to was the pain in my left leg. It was overwhelming, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I had broken my leg once before, but this was far worse. I could barely move. I heard Thomas groaning beside me, telling me he couldn't feel his legs. His voice was filled with fear, and I realized that he might be paralyzed. The worst part was the silence from the front seats. We called out to William and Jack, but they didn't respond. There was no sound, no movement. My gut twisted with the horrible realization that they were dead. Through the haze of pain, I fumbled for my phone. It was a miracle it still worked, even though the screen was cracked. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 and managed to tell them what had happened and where we were. They assured me help was on the way, but it felt like forever. When the paramedics finally arrived, they pulled us out of the wreckage. I don't remember much of the ride to the hospital. The pain in my leg was unbearable, and I drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point, I must have passed out completely. I woke up the next morning in a hospital bed. My whole family was there, crowded around me, their faces red from crying. They looked so relieved that I had survived. But something felt wrong. A nurse came in, and I could tell just by the look on her face that she wasn't bringing good news. She explained in a quiet, sad voice that they had to amputate my left leg. The damage was too severe, and it couldn't be saved. Eventually, I would get a prosthetic. But at that moment, I couldn't think about anything except the fact that my leg was gone. As if that wasn't enough, the nurse also told me that Thomas would never walk again. The paralysis was permanent. And then she said the words I had been dreading. William and Jack hadn't survived the crash. The news hit me like a punch to the chest. 2 of my best friends were gone, just like that. I felt like I couldn't breathe. On top of everything, my hockey career was over. No more skating, no more chasing dreams of going pro. It all ended in one night. In the months that followed, Thomas and I leaned on each other to get through the pain. We both knew we were lucky to be alive, even though the losses weighed heavily on us. We also realized we needed to make a change. The drinking had cost us too much already, so we quit cold turkey. Eventually, we started attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and before long, we were helping run them. Now we spend our time trying to convince others to stop before it's too late. It's not an easy road, but at least we're still here, still fighting. I still think about that night sometimes, about how different things could have been if we had made smarter choices. But the past is something I can't change. All I can do now is keep moving forward one step at a time, even if it's with a bionic leg. I know it's October, but I'm going to tell you about something that happened in the summer of 2018. It's been on my mind ever since, and honestly, I still miss the carefree feeling of summer, despite everything. This happened at a sleepaway camp in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. I had been going to this camp every summer since I was 9 years old, and by the time 2018 rolled around, it was my second to last year. I was about to start high school, and this camp felt like my second home. I knew almost everyone there because it was a mid-sized camp, not too big, not too small, and over the years I had made close friendships. But that summer, I met someone who left me with deep scars, the kind that never fully healed. His name was Ben. He was new to the camp, and I could tell right away because I'd never seen him before. We met on the first day, and I remember thinking he was incredibly attractive. He had this charm about him, and it seemed like he was into me too. We spent most of the day together, talking about our lives. At first, Ben seemed harmless. He came across as sweet, funny, and easy to trust. And at that age, I was still pretty naive, quick to believe in the goodness of others without hesitation. Within a couple of days, we became a couple. It felt so exciting, my first real relationship. We laughed together, and for those first few days, I felt happier than I ever had before. My friends teased me, saying I was abandoning them for a guy. They were joking, but part of me felt a little guilty for spending all my time with Ben. For the next 4 days, it was just Ben and me. We were inseparable, but on the 5th night, everything changed. It was around 9:30 p.m. after our usual evening activities. I went back to my cabin, took a shower, brushed my teeth, and slipped into my pajamas. By 10:30, the lights were out, and everyone else in the cabin had already fallen asleep. I've always had trouble sleeping, though, so I just lay in bed, waiting for sleep to come. About 30 minutes passed, and I started to drift off, the quiet of the night settling over the camp. That's when I heard the door to the cabin creak open. I wasn't alarmed at first. I figured it was just one of the counselors checking on us, or maybe one of the other campers coming back from the bathroom. But then I felt something strange, a slow tug on my blanket. The sensation was so light at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it happened again, more deliberately. My blanket slid down my body, and I felt a hand touching me. A wave of fear washed over me as I realized what was happening. Someone was trying to pull my pants down. My body froze, and for a moment I couldn't move or scream. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it might wake the others. But then instinct kicked in. I grabbed the flashlight I always kept by my bed and switched it on. The light cut through the darkness, and there, standing right in front of me, was Ben. The sight of him standing there, caught in the act, was like a punch to the gut. Without thinking, I screamed, the sound tearing through the cabin. Ben bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. My scream woke everyone else up. The lights came on, and my cabin mate stared at me, confused and groggy, not understanding what had just happened. One of the counselors rushed over to me, asking what was wrong. I was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out, but I told her everything, that Ben had snuck into our cabin and tried to undress me while I was half asleep. The counselor wrapped me in a hug, whispering that everything was going to be okay, but I could barely hear her over the adrenaline pumping in my ears. She said she was going to report it to the camp director right away, and left to do just that. As soon as she was gone, the reality of what had almost happened hit me, and I felt sick to my stomach. I knew at that moment that I couldn't be around Ben anymore. I didn't care what the camp decided. I would stay as far away from him as possible. The next morning after breakfast, the camp director called me and my counselor to his office. I remember feeling anxious the whole way there, wondering what was going to happen. When we got to the office, the director was sitting behind his desk, looking serious. He told me that Ben had been placed on the do not return list, meaning he was permanently banned from the camp. He had been kicked out that very morning. I couldn't hold back the tears. It wasn't just relief, it was an overwhelming sense of gratitude that I was safe and that someone had believed me. I thanked the director, and after that, the rest of my time at camp passed without any more issues, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Now as an adult, I still haven't fully healed from that experience. It left me with trust issues I carry to this day. I even began to identify as asexual afterward, as the thought of being with someone in that way filled me with dread. I haven't heard anything about Ben since then, and honestly, I don't care. What matters is that I'm moving forward, even if it's slow. If there's one thing I want others to take away from this, it's that trust is something that should be earned, not given freely. Be careful, get to know people first, and protect yourself. I learned that the hard way. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was on my last pizza delivery shift. The rain had started early in the evening, drumming against my car's windshield as I drove through the quiet streets. I was tired and just wanted to finish up so I could go home, but there was one last order to deliver. The address was a bit out of the way, a house on the edge of town, the kind of place that people didn't usually go to unless they had a reason. I didn't think much about it at first, just another job to get done. I followed the directions on my phone, driving further away from the familiar streets. The houses became fewer and farther apart, the trees thicker and darker as I moved away from the city lights. The rain picked up, making it hard to see. I turned on my high beams to cut through the sheets of water, and that's when I saw the house. It was old, really old, the kind of house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were dark, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. But the house matched the address on my delivery app. This had to be the place. I pulled up slowly, parking the car right outside the gate. I grabbed the pizza from the passenger seat, hoping to get this over with quickly. I stepped out into the rain, pulling my hood up as I hurried toward the front door. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain was cold and heavy on my skin. I could feel the mud squish beneath my shoes as I walked up the cracked stone path. There was no doorbell, so I knocked. The sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have been. I stood there waiting, but no one came. I knocked again, harder this time, my fist echoing in the empty air. I was about to leave when the door creaked open. Just a little. No one stood there, though. "Hello," I called out, stepping closer to the door. It swung open wider, as if inviting me inside. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of damp wood and dust. The hallway beyond was dark, barely lit by the glow of my car's headlights, shining through the rain. I hesitated. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave the pizza without delivering it. Maybe someone was inside, waiting. I stepped through the door, calling out again. "Pizza delivery." My voice echoed in the space. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The walls were cracked, and the floor creaked under my feet. Dust floated in the air with every step I took. I could hear the rain pounding on the roof, but everything inside was eerily still. No signs of life, no sounds of movement. I looked around, trying to find a table or counter to leave the pizza on, but there was nothing. Just a long hallway that led deeper into the house. The air felt colder, like the temperature had dropped the moment I crossed the threshold. My breath puffed out in front of me, in little white clouds. I thought about turning back, leaving the pizza at the door, and getting out of there. But something made me stay. I can't explain it. It was like I was being pulled forward, deeper into the house. I started walking down the hallway, my footsteps sounding too loud in the silence. The floor creaked under my weight, the wood groaning as if it hadn't been walked on in years. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, but I kept going. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It was slightly open, just like the front door had been. I reached out to push it wider, and as soon as I touched it, a cold breeze blew through the house, making the lights flicker. My hand froze on the door, and for a second I thought I heard something. A whisper, a faint voice, but when I strained to listen, there was only silence. I pushed the door open, and inside was a small room, empty except for an old chair in the corner. There was nothing else, no furniture, no people. Just that chair facing the corner, like someone had been sitting there, staring at the wall for years. The air was thick with dust, and I felt like I was being watched. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But just as I turned to go, I heard it again. The whisper, but this time it was clearer. It was coming from behind me, from the chair. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. A figure barely visible, sitting in the chair. Its outline was faint, like a shadow that didn't belong to anything. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure started to rise from the chair slowly. The air around it grew colder, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest, like the house itself was pushing me out. That's when I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. I burst through the front door, slamming it behind me, and jumped into my car. The rain was coming down harder now, pounding against the roof as I sped away from the house. In 2016, I worked at a post office. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. Most days were pretty routine, answering phones, sorting mail, and dealing with customers. Eventually I found a better job, but my time at the post office left me with one experience I'll never forget. It was a strange phone call that still lingers in my mind. It was a quiet afternoon, right after lunch. The office was peaceful, with only the hum of machines and the occasional ringing of phones. I was sitting at my desk, going through some paperwork, when the phone rang. I picked it up as usual and greeted the caller with the company name and my own. On the other end, a man's voice greeted me. "Hi there, would you sign my petition?" His voice was casual, almost friendly, but it was an odd request. Who calls a post office asking about a petition? I didn't even have time to process his question before his tone changed abruptly. "Sign my petition now," he demanded, his voice growing sharp. I was caught off guard by how quickly the conversation had taken a turn. Before I could even respond, he continued, "Just sign the petition." His voice was full of impatience and frustration. I finally managed to ask, "What petition are you talking about?" But he ignored my question and repeated the same demand, more forceful this time. I could feel my patience wearing thin. This was some kind of prank or a joke, and I wasn't in the mood for it. My frustration got the better of me, and I snapped. "Stop messing with me," I shouted into the phone. Looking back, I still don't know why I reacted so strongly, but at that moment, I couldn't help it. The line went quiet for a second, and then the man's voice came back, colder and more menacing than before. "Sign the petition, or I'll follow you home and hurt your dog." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't even have a dog, but the threat felt personal and disturbing. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled on the other end. "Billy Joe Bob," he said, his tone mocking like it was some kind of joke. "Where are you?" "Let's talk face to face," I challenged, hoping to get some kind of answer out of him. But he kept dodging the question, refusing to give any real information. Instead, he started to play the victim. "Here I am just exercising my rights, and you people freak out over it." His words made no sense, and the way he twisted the conversation only fueled my frustration. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "If you're going to make threats, you better be serious about it," I warned him, my anger bubbling to the surface. He muttered something about me being unreasonable, calling me names that didn't even fit the situation. I could only laugh at how ridiculous he sounded, and then out of nowhere, he switched his tone again. "Can't we all just get along?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. I wasn't having it. "If you want to meet, just say where," I told him, still trying to push him to reveal his location. I even gave him my address, but he kept avoiding the topic, refusing to answer. His frustration boiled over. "You're the one being difficult," he shouted, before launching into another round of insults. I didn't flinch. At this point, I was too irritated to care about what he said. I decided to push back harder. "I'm not afraid of you," I said firmly. But the conversation had already gone in circles too many times. Suddenly, he shifted the tone again, trying to sound clever or intimidating. "You thought today was just another day, but guess what? Surprise!" And then I heard it, a gunshot, loud and clear over the phone. My heart stopped for a moment. Was this guy serious? Was this happening? I sat there in stunned silence for a few seconds, unsure of how to react. But something inside me snapped, and I found myself laughing, almost in disbelief. "I'm not going anywhere today," I said, shaking my head. And with that, I hung up the phone. The office was unusually quiet after I hung up. The usual background noise of computers and printers seemed distant, as if the world had paused for a brief moment. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this call was off. Who was this guy? What did he want? Was it just some twisted prank, or was there something darker lurking behind his words? I never found out. The man never called back, and as the days passed, I tried to put the incident behind me. But now and then, when I think back on that day, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I had stayed on the line a little longer, or if I had tried to find out more about him. The memory of that phone call still sends a chill down my spine, and I'll never forget the strange, unsettling feeling it left me with. Sometimes it's the things we don't fully understand that linger the longest. I've worked as a security guard for most of my life. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. Gas stations, convenience stores, small shops, places where you're mostly just sitting around, keeping an eye on things. But when I saw the ad for a night shift at the local mall, I thought I'd finally stumbled on something better. The pay was good, better than anything I'd seen in years. The hours weren't bad either, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was just one building, and I figured it would be quiet and easy. How hard could it be? I could already imagine sitting back in the security office, watching the cameras, and walking around in a place that felt too big for the silence of the night. I applied immediately and got a call the next day. It was the manager, Mr. Hensley, asking if I could come in for an interview that afternoon. It seemed sudden, but I didn't question it. I needed the job, and the mall wasn't far from where I lived. I drove over, trying to shake the feeling that this was all happening too fast. Was the mall that desperate for a night guard? The interview was quick, almost rushed. Hensley asked about my experience, but it didn't feel like he was paying attention. He ran through the basics, checked the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, do hourly patrols, nothing out of the ordinary. By the end of it, he looked at me and asked, "Can you start tonight?" That surprised me. Most places want time for paperwork or background checks, but I wasn't about to argue. "Sure," I said, trying not to sound too eager. He looked relieved. "Great, we're understaffed," he admitted, rubbing his temples like the day had been too long. "Last few guards didn't last. I hope you'll be different." His words gave me pause. What did he mean by that? But before I could ask, he handed me a key to the office and told me to report at 11 p.m. sharp. The quicker I started, the quicker I'd get paid, I told myself. I shook his hand, left the office, and went home to get a few hours of sleep before my shift. When I arrived at the mall, it was dark and deserted. The parking lot, which during the day was packed with cars, was almost entirely empty. A few scattered vehicles sat under the dim glow of the parking lights, but the space felt too big, too quiet. It made the building look like a sleeping giant, and for a second, I considered turning around and going home. Something felt wrong. I brushed it off as first-day nerves and walked up to the employee entrance. Mr. Hensley met me at the door. He didn't say much, just led me through the winding corridors to the security office, explaining the basic protocols again as we walked. The office itself was small, a cramped room at the back of the mall filled with screens displaying grainy footage from the cameras scattered around the building. "Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, he reminded me. "Do your rounds. Make sure nothing's out of place. The usual." He glanced at me before adding, "And keep an eye on the escalators in the play area. Things happen there sometimes." That last part made me pause. "Things happen?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Kids mostly, trying to sneak in or mess around after hours. You'll see." I nodded, though his tone made my skin crawl a little. He handed me a printed sheet of standard instructions, shook my hand again, and said, "Good luck. I'll see you in the morning." Once he left, I was alone. The silence of the empty mall settled over me like a heavy blanket. I took a seat in front of the monitors, flipping through the camera feeds. The escalators were still, the stores dark and empty. For a moment, I relaxed. It was just a mall, nothing creepy about that. Just a big, empty building. After a few minutes, I felt a presence behind me. I jumped, my heart pounding. There, standing just beside me, was a janitor. He grinned, clearly amused by my reaction. "Didn't mean to scare you, buddy," he said, his voice light. "You must be the new guy." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "Yeah, that's me. I didn't know there was a janitor here at night." He shrugged. "They always keep one of us around to clean up, make sure everything's ready for the next day." His tone turned a bit more serious. "Just make sure you follow the rules." I blinked. "The rules? You mean the instructions?" He handed me a crumpled piece of paper, looking at me with an unsettling seriousness. "These aren't from the manager. These are the rules you'll need if you want to make it through the night." I unfolded the paper, half expecting some kind of joke, but the list of rules it contained was anything but funny. Rules to keep you safe at night. Rule 1. Check the security cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but don't stare at the footage for too long. Rule 2. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If the mannequins change positions, leave the area immediately. I stared at the list, my gut tightening with discomfort. "You're serious?" The janitor's grin had vanished. "I'm warning you. Follow the rules, or you'll end up like the last guy." I tried to laugh it off. "You mean the last guard?" He nodded, his eyes cold. He quit after one night. Okay. I stuffed the paper into my pocket without checking the rest of the list, chuckling nervously. Well, I'm gonna make my first round. The janitor stepped aside, giving me a long look before saying, "Take care." I nodded and left the office, but his words stuck with me. Something about his tone, his look. It felt off, like he was genuinely afraid. But I wasn't going to let some weird list of rules mess with my head. It was just past midnight when I started my patrol. The mall was eerie at night, much more so than I expected. The dim lighting cast long, twisting shadows along the tiled floors. Every sound felt amplified, my footsteps echoing off the walls, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant creaks and groans of the building settling. As I made my way down one of the main hallways, I tried to focus on the task at hand. The mall wasn't huge, but it was big enough to need regular patrols. There were plenty of stores to check, some of them abandoned, some locked up, with displays peeking out from the darkness behind their glass fronts. A children's play area stood near the food court, silent and still, the colorful plastic toys looking strange and lifeless under the dim emergency lights. Farther down, I could make out the escalators, still and frozen in their usual ascent, like relics from a busier time. I was getting used to the silence when I noticed something strange in one of the clothing stores. The store door was wide open. I stopped, my flashlight sweeping over the darkened interior. I couldn't see anything out of place at first, but as I moved the beam around the store, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, a slight shift, like something or someone was hiding in the dark. I turned my head to look directly at it, but there was nothing, just a few mannequins standing near the back, as motionless as always. I sighed and shook my head. It was nothing, just my nerves. I wasn't going to let that janitor's creepy list get into my head. Then I heard it, the faint sound of clothing rustling. My flashlight flicked back toward the mannequins, and there it was. One of them had definitely moved. It was standing a little closer now, slightly out of position compared to the others. I could feel my heartbeat start to quicken. "Hey, Mr. Janitor." I called out, more out of frustration than anything else. This had to be some kind of prank. He was probably watching me from the shadows, trying to freak me out. But there was no answer, just the soft, unsettling shuffle of fabric behind me again. I turned slowly, my flashlight scanning the mannequins, and that's when I saw it. One of them had changed positions again, its head now facing directly toward the exit. My breath hitched in my throat. No one else was here. There was no way this was a trick. I backed out of the store quickly. I didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. As I walked away, I kept glancing over my shoulder. And then I heard it. Footsteps. But not normal footsteps. They were heavy, rough, like wood or plastic scraping against the floor. My heart started pounding in my chest. I turned around, and there it was, the same mannequin from the store. It stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at me with its blank, lifeless face. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I watched it. Slowly, stiffly, it started to move toward me, its joints creaking and groaning with every step. Its movements were robotic, stiff, like a doll being dragged forward. I did what any sane person would do. I ran. I turned on my heel and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the mall. I didn't care how ridiculous I looked. I just needed to get away from that thing. I rounded the corner, ducking into the hallway that led toward the restrooms. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. I burst into the restroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But as I looked into the mirror, I saw something else. A woman was standing near the stalls, her back to me, dressed in the plain uniform of a cleaning lady. I blinked, and she was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was no one there. The restroom was empty. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted and terrified. What was happening? I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of it all, but nothing was adding up. Then I remembered the list. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and unfolded it with shaking hands. There, written plainly in black ink, were the next few rules. Rule 3. If a mannequin looks like it's following you, don't look back. Mannequins sometimes follow guards, but if you ignore them, they'll stop. If you look, they'll know you're aware, and they'll get closer. I felt my heart sink. I had looked. Rule 4. Avoid looking into the mirrors of the restroom. Too late for that. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized I had already broken 2 of the rules. Whatever was happening, I was making it worse. Rule 5. If you hear someone talking inside an abandoned store, do not listen. I swallowed hard. I hadn't heard anyone yet, but just knowing the rule had made me uneasy. Rule 6. If you hear a child laughing from the play area, leave immediately. Rule 7. If you check the time and it's earlier than the last time you looked, immediately return to the security office. I glanced at my watch, instinctively checking the time. It read 11:30 p.m. My blood ran cold. There was no way it was 11:30. I had started my patrol after midnight, and it had been a while since then. This wasn't possible. I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed out of the restroom, my heart racing as I made my way back toward the security office. The air around me seemed heavier now, more oppressive, and the lights overhead flickered faintly. The mall, once a place I had thought would be quiet and safe, now felt like a living entity, watching and waiting. I reached the office, slamming the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, my nerves frayed. I checked my watch again. It was almost 1 a.m. That seemed right, but what had happened earlier? Why had the time changed like that? I sat down, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to keep my head on straight. I wasn't going to let this place get to me. I pulled out the list again, reading through the remaining rules. Rule 8. Lock the security office door between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. and do not open it for anyone. If they knock, they might not be the person you think they are. Check the cameras to confirm. Rule 9. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. Rule 10. If you hear an escalator running, do not investigate. Watch the area on the security cameras. Rule 11. Under no circumstances should you leave before your shift ends. If you do, you risk something following you outside the mall. I let out a nervous laugh. What kind of job had I taken? Who had written these rules? I couldn't make sense of any of it, but as I sat there, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. The mannequin, the time shifting, the figure in the mirror. This wasn't normal. Whatever was going on, I needed to survive the night. It was past 1 a.m., and I needed to go for another round. As much as I wanted to stay locked in the security office, I knew I had to follow the security protocols also. The cameras showed nothing unusual, so I gathered my courage and stepped back out into the mall. As I walked cautiously through the main hallway, I started hearing something. A faint mumbling coming from an abandoned store. My blood ran cold as I remembered Rule 5. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. The mumbling sound coming from the abandoned store was quiet, barely audible over the faint hum of the mall's air conditioning. But it was unmistakable. There was someone or something talking inside. I forced myself to move, my legs feeling like lead. Rule 5 echoed in my head. If you hear someone talking inside an abandoned store, do not listen. I tried to block out the sound, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the soft, incomprehensible murmurs persisted, growing louder the closer I got to the store. I glanced at the glass storefront. The windows were covered with paper, blocking any view of the inside. My breath hitched as I quickened my pace, refusing to even glance in its direction. I didn't want to know what was behind those papers or what was causing that sound. The voice was rising now, clearer but still distorted, like someone talking underwater. I had to get away. I made it past the store, refusing to look back. The voice began to fade, and I felt the tension in my body ease slightly. But as I turned the corner and entered the next corridor, I heard it again. Footsteps, but not normal footsteps. They were rough, uneven, like the dragging sound of something solid scraping against the floor, almost like wood or plastic. My stomach twisted. I knew what it was before I even turned around. It was the mannequin. My instinct screamed at me not to look back, remembering Rule 3. If a mannequin looks like it's following you, don't look back. If you ignore them, they'll stop. If you look, they'll know you're aware, and they'll get closer. I walked faster, keeping my eyes straight ahead, trying to ignore the growing sound of the mannequin's movements behind me. Each step it took seemed heavier, more deliberate. My heart raced as the footsteps grew closer, but I didn't dare turn around. Just keep walking. Just keep walking, I told myself. The sound of the mannequin's movement grew fainter, and eventually I could no longer hear it. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and slowed my pace. My hands were shaking, but at least I had followed the rule. Whatever was following me had stopped for now. Then I heard something else. The distant hum of machinery. An escalator running. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Rule 10. If you hear an escalator running, do not investigate. Watch the area on the security cameras. I turned on my heel and bolted for the security office. I wasn't going to risk breaking another rule, especially after what I had just been through. My mind raced as I rushed back down the hallway, past the now quiet abandoned store, and toward the safety of the security office. I could hear the escalator in the distance, that unmistakable mechanical whir. But I didn't stop. I burst into the office, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I immediately turned my attention to the security monitors, flipping through the camera feeds. The escalator camera came into view, and there it was. A figure. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was something else. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and spindly, its face obscured by shadows. It was standing on the escalator, its body stiff and jerky, moving in slow, unnatural movements as the steps carried it upward. I stared at the screen, frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The figure's head turned slowly, as if sensing something. And then, impossibly, it looked straight at the camera, straight at me. The monitors started flickering, static filling the screens, a loud buzzing sound filling the room. I snapped my gaze away from the camera, remembering Rule 1. Don't stare at the footage for too long. The buzzing stopped almost immediately, and when I glanced back at the monitors, the escalator was empty. The figure was gone. I sat back in my chair, my body trembling. I couldn't do this anymore. My nerves were shot, and the rules, those damned rules, were starting to feel like a cruel game designed to break me. I just had to make it through the night. Just a few more hours, I told myself. The next hours passed in silence. I stayed in the security office, too shaken to do another round. I kept glancing at the monitors, watching the empty hallways, the still stores, the escalator that remained motionless now. Everything seemed calm, but the air in the office was thick with tension. Then I heard something that sent a cold wave of dread down my spine. A knock at the door. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I froze, my eyes darting toward the security monitors to check the hallway outside the office. There was no one there. But the knock came again, 3 sharp raps against the door, as if someone was standing just outside. And then I heard a voice. Hey, how's the night going? Still think the rules are funny? It was the janitor, or at least it sounded like him. I swallowed hard, remembering Rule 8. Lock the security office door between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., and do not open it for anyone. If they knock, they might not be the person you think they are. Check the cameras to confirm. I glanced at the clock. It was 4:03 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked the camera feed again. The hallway outside the office was completely empty, but the knocking continued, more insistent this time. The janitor's voice echoed through the door, sounding friendly but somehow off. Come on, open up. I'll tell you what's really going on here. I stood frozen, my hand hovering near the door handle. My mind raced. It sounded like the janitor, but I knew better than to trust my instincts at this point. I checked the camera again. Still nothing. The hallway was empty. I couldn't open the door. I wouldn't. The knocking stopped suddenly. Silence filled the office again, and I let out a shaky breath. I kept watching the camera, not daring to move until finally the janitor appeared on the screen. He was standing right outside the door now, staring straight into the camera. He knocked again. His face twisted into an eerie grin. I felt my stomach drop. The way he stared into the camera. It didn't seem human. His body started to waver, like he was made of smoke, and then slowly he dissipated into the air, leaving nothing but an empty hallway. I checked the clock. For 30 a.m., whatever it had been, it was gone now. For the first time in hours, the air felt still. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over me seemed to lift, if only a little. I could feel the tension easing from my shoulders, though my body still felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. I stood up, my muscles aching from being hunched over the monitors for so long. I needed to stretch my legs, to move around, if only to shake off the lingering dread that clung to me like a shadow. After everything that had happened, I wasn't keen on doing another full patrol, but staying in the office felt stifling. Maybe a short walk, just around the immediate area of the office, would help clear my head. The mall was still deathly quiet, the faint hum of electricity the only sound that echoed through the corridors. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift as I walked. I kept my eyes down, trying not to focus on the mannequins, the stores, or the eerie silence that had settled over everything. As I rounded the corner near the security office, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The janitor was standing there, leaning casually against the wall with that same friendly grin he'd had the first time we met. It was the real janitor this time, at least I hoped it was. He seemed more human, more tangible than the strange apparition I'd seen earlier in the night. Rough night? He asked, his voice light, almost teasing. I didn't know how to respond. I stood there, my mind racing as I tried to reconcile what I had seen earlier. The knocks, the figure dissolving into mist, with the man standing in front of me now. You could say that, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head, his grin fading slightly. You followed the rules, didn't you? I tried, I said, my throat dry. What is this place? Why are these rules even a thing? The janitor let out a low chuckle, but it wasn't the friendly, warm sound it had been earlier in the night. This laugh was hollow, tinged with something darker. I told you the rules are there to keep you safe, he said, his eyes narrowing. There's more going on here than you understand. Much more. I took a step back, my unease growing with every word he spoke. What do you mean? What's going on in this mall? He shrugged, the grin returning to his face. You'll figure it out, or maybe you won't. Either way, there's no escaping it. He started to walk away, turning down the dimly lit corridor without another word. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he wasn't in any rush to leave. I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what he was talking about. I needed answers. Wait, I called after him, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. What do you mean no escaping it? What are you trying to say? The janitor didn't stop. He kept walking, his footsteps eerily quiet against the tiled floor. Desperation and frustration bubbled up inside me, and before I knew it, I was following him, determined to get some kind of explanation. I rounded the corner after him, but when I got there, the hallway was empty. He was gone. Again, my heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring down the empty corridor. There was no way he could have disappeared so quickly. He had just been there. I looked around, scanning the area for any sign of him, but the mall had fallen back into its eerie silence. And then I heard it, a soft, muffled crying. The sound was faint at first, almost too quiet to notice, but as I stood there, frozen in place, it grew louder, more distinct. A woman's voice, sobbing quietly somewhere nearby. My skin prickled with unease. I knew the rules. I had them memorized by now, and I knew exactly what this was. Rule 9. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. I swallowed hard, trying to block out the sound, but the crying persisted. It seemed to be coming from one of the stores up ahead, the muffled sobs echoing faintly through the deserted hallways. Every instinct I had was telling me to walk away, to get back to the office, and wait out the last hour of my shift in silence. But there was something about the crying that pulled me toward it, an almost magnetic force that made it impossible to ignore. What if someone really needed help? What if this was all in my head? What if the rules were just some sick jokes? I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had already broken too many of the rules tonight. This wasn't a joke. The janitor had warned me, and I wasn't about to ignore him now. But still, the crying continued. It was louder now, more insistent, the sound echoing from somewhere deeper in the store just ahead of me. It didn't sound right. It was too hollow, too distorted, like a recording of someone crying rather than an actual person. I stood there, torn between curiosity and fear, until finally the decision was made for me. The crying stopped. Suddenly, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls of the mall were closing in on me. My chest tightened, and I realized I had been holding my breath. Then, slowly, a figure appeared on one of the security cameras I had been monitoring through the corridor. I had left the office, but the cameras were still connected to my device. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen as I saw her. A woman pale, with long, dark hair that hung limply over her face, obscuring her features. She was dressed in plain, outdated clothing, her body hunched over as she moved slowly down the hallway, her feet barely touching the ground. She was floating. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched her approach the dressing room, her body drifting closer to the entrance, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She hovered just outside the door, as if waiting for me to follow her inside. I took a step back, my pulse racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had seen things tonight, strange things, but this was something else entirely. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the figure to disappear, to leave me alone. When I opened them, she was gone. But the crying had started again, this time, right behind me. I didn't think. I bolted down the hallway, running as fast as my legs would carry me. The sound of the woman's cries echoed through the halls, growing louder and more desperate with every step I took. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare risk another glance. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. Now, by the time I reached the security office, I was breathless, my entire body trembling with fear. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it as quickly as I could, and collapsed into the chair in front of the monitors. My chest heaved with each breath, the adrenaline still coursing through me. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, with no way out but the faint hope that my shift would end soon. I glanced at the monitors. My heart sank. There she was, the woman. The same pale figure, her hair hanging limply over her face, moving in that unnatural, hovering way. She was no longer just roaming the halls. She was headed directly toward the security office. My blood ran cold as I watched her on the monitors. She floated down the hallway, closer and closer, her slow, jerky movements unnerving. She didn't walk like a normal person. She barely moved her feet at all, gliding just above the ground. The sobbing was gone, but the weight of her presence was suffocating. It was as if the very air around her distorted with her approach, bending reality itself. I checked the camera feeds desperately, flipping between angles. She was getting closer. My breath quickened as I watched her drift past the closed stores, her face obscured by her hair, her arms limp at her sides. Every second she got nearer, and I felt my panic rising, clawing at my throat. I reached for the list of rules, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. Don't open the door. I repeated the thought over and over in my head, like a mantra. Don't open the door, no matter what. The woman stopped just outside the security office. I could see her now on the monitor, the camera trained right on the door. She stood there, silent and still, like a statue. For a moment I dared to hope that she would leave, that maybe she'd fade away like a bad dream. But then the knocking started, soft at first, barely a tap. But each knock grew louder, more forceful, until it felt like the entire door was rattling. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. She was there, just inches away on the other side, and I could feel her presence like a cold weight pressing down on me. I checked the monitor again, praying she would vanish, but she didn't. Her body was rigid, unmoving, but the knocking continued, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. The door frame shook as if it wouldn't hold much longer. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block her out. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the knocking only grew more intense, more insistent, like someone pounding with their fists. My heart raced, my body trembling as I stared at the door, unable to move. Then I heard it. "Hey, open up, it's the manager." I froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Mr. Hensley. But something felt wrong. I checked the clock, my heart thundering in my chest. 6:01 a.m. relief washed over me, but suspicion crept in immediately. Was it really him? Or was this another trick? I checked the camera one last time. The woman was gone. No sign of the pale figure. No shadow. No presence. Everything okay in there? Mr. Hensley's voice called again, sounding closer now, more concerned. "Open up, your shift's over." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. I had survived the night, hadn't I? The clock showed it was past 6 a.m., and nothing had come for me in those final moments. But the events of the night had shaken me to the core, and I wasn't ready to trust anything, anyone, without checking one last time. I glanced at the monitor one last time, double-checking the feed outside the office. And there he was, Mr. Hensley, standing just outside the door, looking exactly as he had when I first met him. No eerie figure, no distorted face. Just him, the manager. With a trembling hand, I unlocked the door and opened it. Mr. Hensley stood there, his expression softening as he saw the look on my face. "Rough night, huh?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. "Yeah, you could say that." He frowned, noticing the look of fear etched across my face. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed bitterly under my breath. "Something like that." I didn't go into detail. I didn't tell him about the mannequin or the crying woman. It didn't seem real anymore. I was just happy the night was over. But something gnawed at me, something that I needed to know before I left this place for good. "What about the janitor?" I asked suddenly. "The one who works the night shift?" Mr. Hensley looked at me, puzzled. "What janitor?" My stomach dropped. "The one who was here all night." He gave me a list of rules to follow. Mr. Hensley shook his head, his expression turning serious. "There's no night janitor. No one works here at night except you." My mind reeled. The pieces didn't fit together. None of it made sense. I stared at Mr. Hensley, my thoughts racing. If there was no janitor, then who or what had been warning me? And the rules? Where had they come from? I didn't ask any more questions. I handed him my keys, quit on the spot, and walked out of the mall without looking back. Whatever had happened there, whatever lurked in the dark corners of that place. I wasn't going to stick around to find out more. As I drove away, the weight of the night still heavy on my chest, I realized that some places are better left alone. And that mall, it was one of them. I will never return to that place again.